All right, we're back. Tom, this is try number 2. Last time we had some technical difficulties, but I'm really excited to have you on the show. And I was thinking about how to frame this conversation, and I thought the first question to ask you is, so you've been involved in animal rights for a long time. You've served jail time for your animal rights activism, along with other activists on the SHAC campaign. I'll ask you about what SHAC was in just a minute. But I thought maybe we could start this conversation because I think you probably have experienced this more than maybe anybody on the planet Earth, or certainly more than almost anybody on the planet Earth. Why do you think it is that people hate animal advocates so much? Or do you agree with me that there's a lot of hatred towards animal rights activists?
I mean, I think there is, and it goes throughout society. I read a report recently from the undercover policing inquiry in the UK,
Mm.
and some of the undercover cops in the 90s and early 2000s who were embedded in the animal liberation movement, they were amazed how much hate they got from other cops that didn't know they were undercover just because they were animal rights activists. So everyone hates us, particularly the cops, but also society. And I think the reason is quite simple. I think the reason people find our movement so difficult to stomach and so difficult to even begin contemplating is because virtually every other social movement certainly in modern history has only asked the public to make fairly small changes of behavior. I
Mm.
think if you look, the civil rights movement, yes, they wanted laws changed. Yes, they need certain businesses to change business practices. But broadly, for the public, they're just saying, be less of an asshole, just be more
Mhm.
tolerant. That's it.
Yeah.
Like the right to marry, again, yeah, we want politicians to change stuff, but you, the person on the street,
Yeah.
just be
You don't have
nicer,
to
just
change
be
things
kinder.
3 times a day. Yeah.
Right. Whereas us, our like baseline ask of everyone is change your diet, change your clothes, change your entertainment, change your job, be the asshole at every family event, lose all your friends, be vegan, and then become an activist. So
Yeah.
I think it's quite
Sounds like
simple.
a great marketing pitch.
It
Be
works
an
every
asshole, lose all your friends, have no fun in life.
it works every time. But
Yeah.
yeah, so I think asking people this huge change, and then beyond that, what we're talking about, the issues we're talking about, are the worst thing that has happened on this planet in history. Like what we are doing to other animals in terms of scale is just
Yeah.
incomprehensible. And so when people, if you do convince someone to make these big life changes, you're then asking them to acknowledge that firstly, they were involved in something horrific, but also so is everyone they love, everyone they care about, everyone they respect. And not only were they involved, they're still involved. Your parents, your family, your friends. These people are involved in something terrible. So it's a lot easier, I think, for people to just have that knee-jerk reaction of, I don't want to think about this because this is going to get really uncomfortable really quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's something that's definitely correct about what you said, that the animal rights movement seems to be challenging people in a way that some of these other social justice movements is not. But my personal view of it is it's not inherent to our movement. It has a lot to do with the framing of our advocacy. That we don't have to talk as much about how we hate what you're doing 3 times a day. We can talk about that we hate what these big corporations and governments are doing, not just 3 times a day, but every second of every day. Because one thing I'm 100% on board with, and I think it's just correct, and it's important for all animal advocates to understand, is this is the worst thing that human beings have done in the history of our species, and it's not even close. If you look at both the scale and severity of suffering, even just land animals. I mean, setting aside aquatic animals, and the aquatic animal atrocities are, an order of magnitude greater than what happens on land animals. But even just land animals, I mean, just the sheer numbers are astonishing to the point that it's hard to even comprehend. I mean, this is like the Holocaust of Holocausts, in a lot of ways. And apologize to anyone who doesn't like that comparison. And I'm certainly not trying to diminish the experience of anyone who had a family member or an ancestor who experienced something horrible in the 1940s in Germany. But it is the case that you have literally tens of billions of creatures confined in conditions that are worse than any concentration camp in human history, who are slaughtered in ways that it sounds like it's from sort of horror movie. I mean, animals being scalded alive. 5% of animals in the United States in industrial slaughterhouses eviscerated while they're still conscious. And so I think, for me, a big part of the reason people respond negatively is not so much that they don't agree that these things are awful, because when most people see these things, they agree this is awful. This is so intolerable that I can't even look at it. It's that we frame our messaging too often in a way that makes them feel like the bad guy. And we got to find ways to make them feel like the good guy, which honestly was one of the beauties of the SHAC campaign, right? It was an animal rights campaign that focused on the systemic corporate evil. But maybe can we talk about that? I said that you've experienced this hate more than most of us on this planet. So tell us, what was the SHAC campaign?
So the SHAC campaign started in 1999 after video footage came out, undercover footage from 2 laboratories owned by Huntington Life Sciences, which was the largest animal testing laboratory in Europe. And it's an interesting thing. The footage was horrific, obviously, as it always is. There's dogs being punched in the face and primates cut open without anesthesia and all kinds of atrocities. I think one slight issue with the whole thing was I think it almost made it seem exceptional that this was like the worst of the worst. But Huntington was just another contract research organization. If you had gone into any other of their rivals or competitors at the time and now, you would see the exact same behavior in the exact same ways. But the footage, it inspired this campaign. And I mean, obviously, that, as with everything, it has roots in many, many other things. And, we didn't invent the wheel here, but it was 3 people founded it, Greg, Natasha, and Heather. And really, their kind of, I guess, their vision, their idea, and what made SHAC special was they weren't just going to protest this company. They were going to close them down. And that was like the red line. Like, we're not fucking about. We're going to close this place down. And I think just kind of coming into it with that attitude and off the back of other successful campaigns, pressure campaigns that they'd run and won, they came into it with this energy and this attitude, and everyone just bought in because, we're going to win. There was no question we're going to win. And to do it, there was really, we have what I often refer to as the SHAC model, and I won't get too into it, but 2 big things I think that made SHAC so effective and so feared by the governments across both sides of the Atlantic was, firstly, we made it our business to understand their business. So we researched everything about what a multinational corporation needs to stay open. And, we knew what grey markets were, we knew what market makers were, and the pink sheets, and all these things that, most people working in these companies don't know about. But we knew everything about their operations. We had whistleblowers, we had surveillance, we had all kinds of things going on, so that we could identify every company that Huntington Life Sciences needed to operate, but that didn't need them. And then we would take up protests. We stayed at Huntington, it was almost daily protests at the laboratories, but we also took most of our protest away from there and into the industrial estates, the boardrooms, the housing estates, anywhere we needed to be to focus on these secondary targets and sometimes tertiary targets. And the other thing that made it special was, as I said, we kind of went into residential neighborhoods. We recognized that every terrible thing that happens on this planet, it's not just humans doing it. It's not just a business doing it. It's individuals are signing these contracts. Individuals are sitting down around board tables or on phones or on email, and they're making these decisions that allow terrible things to happen. And so they should be held accountable. So we would turn up, outside their houses, inside their offices, outside their golf clubs. Did a protest inside someone's private swimming pool once. But anywhere we needed to be, just to remind these people that, if these animals can't clock off at 5, then neither can they.
Yeah. And I think that concept of tertiary targeting, it was something pretty new to the animal rights movement, and honestly, maybe even new to activist movements in general. I haven't heard too much about it in the environmental movement, and it was extraordinarily effective for a short period of time. And then kind of, I don't know what your diagnosis of the problem was, but my view is, in the United States at least, it wasn't primarily the government sledgehammer coming down that stopped the campaign. It was kind of, and I know this is just not part of the theory of change in SHAC, and we can have a conversation about whether it should be, because I've had a lot of conversations with my good friend Lauren about this. Do you know Lauren, by the way? Gazzola? Did you ever meet her?
Not personally, but obviously I know of Lauren, yeah.
Yeah, so Lauren was one of, the 2 or 3 people leading SHAC in the United States. Amazing human being, just like, honestly, just one of the best human beings on the face of the planet Earth. Incredibly smart. And actually, one question I have about this campaign is just, how did it attract so many incredibly talented people? Because I think this is like an underappreciated aspect of the SHAC campaign success. Because part of the reason you were able to do such successful research, part of the reason you were able to organize such successful demonstrations, is because I didn't know the people in the UK very well, but I know the people in the United States. Kevin was I think he was the president of SHAC USA. I forget his
He's the
exact title.
founder, yeah.
But Kevin, just legit, probably the best speaker in animal rights I've ever heard speak. Just amazing speaker. Lauren, the best strategist and organizer. I mean, literally, of all the people I've met, I don't know if there's anyone I think is just a better straight up organizer and just like crossing her T's, dotting her I's, doing the stuff that needs to get done so a protest actually happens. Jake Conroy, just one of the best designers in animal rights history. And I say this despite the fact I'm not a big fan of Jake Conroy. He doesn't like me. We get into a lot of fights. He really hates the work I do. And he's been a thorn in my side for a long time. And I will still say Jake is one of the best designers. He's just a brilliant, and he's a great video editor too. That's why his channels do well, because he's creatively just brilliant. And SHAC just had up and down. It had so many extremely talented people. But I'm getting a little far afield off my original point, which is I think one of the reasons SHAC fell apart, at least in the United States, in my view, is they lost the moral high ground and therefore public support. And I'm not saying public support always matters, because I think annoying the public to me is not a problem. Like, I think that's part of what activists do. We should annoy the public. But the thing that really lost the moral high ground for SHAC was a number of actions, many of which, in fact, all of which were not actually done by its leadership, that were perceived and in some case actually were violent. And that's like, you talk about red lines. I love the red line of saying, we're going to shut this place down because they're torturing dogs. I think that's a great red line. I'm interested in your thoughts on this, but I think a red line the movement should have had back then and has adopted, at least in the United States, and I think to a certain extent in the UK too, and this might be wrong, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, is a red line of violence, that we cannot even use violent rhetoric. We should not be aggressive. I almost think the more radical your actions are, the more direct action you're doing, the more you have to come across as very kind and compassionate people. And that's my view as to why things went south in the United States. But I don't know. What's your take? Do you think that's wrong?
That's a lot to get into.
Sorry, I went in 1,000 different directions in one comment. So take whatever you want from any of that and tell me what I'm wrong about.
I mean, I think the first thing is things went wrong in different places for different reasons, because
interesting.
The thing with SHAC was it was essentially non-hierarchical. So in the UK, we had Greg Natasha Heather founded it, and they were really the strategic core of it. And then you'd have like a kind of fairly fluid group of people around them that were kind of attracted to the campaign and had varying levels of direct involvement in organizing. But 99% of the actions in the UK that were SHAC actions weren't organized by that core of people. They were organized by our local group network. We used to have a really strong local group network, which is something I'm working on trying to rebuild at the moment. But we had this network. So, in my local town of Bournemouth down on the south coast, we were quite a radical group, and we would do banner drops and lock-ons. And I don't remember going on a protest and not trying to run inside or do something annoying. But then, other groups would just stand outside and hand out leaflets. And so everyone was kind of doing what they felt best. And then all of our stuff would go on the SHAC website. And this is, I think, where SHAC USA and SHAC UK differed, because again, SHAC USA wasn't controlled by SHAC UK. Like, each country was entirely independent, and they kind of operated within the bounds of their cultural and legal kind of obligations, I suppose, in each country. Because SHAC was a lawful campaign. And certainly in the UK, SHAC was a lawful campaign. We all ended up going to prison for it, but it was a lawful campaign. Other people, the Animal Liberation Front, the Militant Forces Against Animal Life Sciences, the Justice Department, whoever else, they weren't lawful, and they were overtly not lawful. But that wasn't SHAC, and that wasn't being organized by SHAC. That was people that were inspired by this campaign that refused to criticize people taking whatever action they felt best, because who are we to tell other people they're right or wrong? We don't, in my opinion, we just don't know. Like, different tactics work. So SHAC USA operated very differently from the UK in that they publicized everything on the SHAC USA website, whereas in the UK we only really publicized the lawful protest. And so we had things like
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so
that didn't stop you from getting sent to jail, though, which is terrible.
It got So here it was a big part, the heavy hand of the state, and it ramped up. And I don't want to say we were smarter in the UK, but I think in the USA it was a younger movement, and it was. I think there was this kind of really hubristic belief that the First Amendment was going to protect them. And
Yeah.
so they could, they could
They
put
could say whatever
adverts.
they wanted. Yeah.
Right, they'd put an advert for a brick on the back of their newsletter, or make like
Hmm.
match
Hmm.
boxes with Huntington's address on. Like, we wouldn't do that in the UK because we know we just get arrested and sent to prison
Wow.
for incitement. So it was operated very differently in different countries, and it's operated differently in Russia, and it was operated
Yeah.
differently in Canada and Mexico and New Zealand and everywhere we were. Each local chapter acted how they thought was most appropriate for their culture. So it's different how it ended. I think in the USA, I think it's just worth remembering when SHAC appeared on the scene, what the animal rights movement was in the
Hmm.
USA. And it was tiny, really.
Hmm.
And it was, you know,
Especially the grassroots. The grassroots is virtually
it was
non-existent
predominantly
before Shaq.
welfarist. It was
Yep.
predominantly welfarist. And
Hmm.
SHAC showing up at these conferences where everyone's asking for bigger cages, and then SHAC are there with a massive, or SHAC USA with a massive banner of like an ALF activist holding a dog. People were like, what is this? But I think
Yeah.
we had to be confrontational. And again, I think it's very easy to kind of see this through a modern lens, but in the early 2000s, being vegan was weird. Like,
Hmm.
we were weird. Like, and it was very, I remember newspaper articles in big British newspapers, just, calling us a bunch of like lentil eating, rainwater drinking hippies. Like,
Yeah.
and it was easy for them just to disparage us. They're
Yeah.
vegan, they're idiots. And to make people listen, like, the only agency we had was to go and make them listen. And so
Yeah.
to go into their boardrooms with a VHS cassette and be like, we need you to watch this footage and make a decision about what your business is doing, or stand outside their house until they listen. So I think we had to be quite radical like that. And I don't know if that was, what ended SHAC USA. I'm sure it was part of it. And I'm sure, there were certain actions that weren't helpful. I think the biggest mistake we made was that we allowed ourselves to be isolated from the rest of the radical left.
Hmm.
And it wasn't deliberate. Like, virtually every SHAC activist I knew or know was, fairly hard leaning in that direction. But we were so focused on what we were doing with SHAC, we just didn't have time to do more than what we were doing with SHAC. And really, those kind of network buildings and that
Yeah.
kind of community building, I think that would have been incredibly helpful, because, when they came for us in the UK, our largest human rights organization, Liberty, they refused to talk to us because they'd already been
Wow.
lobbied by the vivisection industry. So even that, we were like, they're facing these ridiculous trumped up charges, and our biggest human rights organization wouldn't even talk to us about it. And I kind of feel we have ownership of that because
Yeah.
we didn't build those networks. So I think
But is that because of the failure of network building and
yeah.
community building, or is that because someone went after Brian Cass with a baseball bat or whatever it
No,
was? I don't even.
no,
Because
like,
in the United States, I feel like the same thing happened. Like a lot of the animal welfare organizations, the animal rights organizations, like most infamously, the Humane Society of the United States, came out with a public statement saying the activists deserve to be imprisoned. And these are activists just running a website. It wasn't even, like you said, it wasn't even the people actually smashing windows and doing those things. It was just people like Lauren, who is a student at NYU, graduated magna cum laude, has never been charged with anything illegal herself, and was running a website. And you have even the Humane Society, not even the civil rights organizations, but even the Humane Society saying, yeah, put her in jail. And I think a big part of the reason was because they lost the moral high ground. And if they had maintained the moral high ground, and I didn't know the UK had this policy that you didn't post illegal actions, because in the United States it definitely wasn't true. They were posting the wildest stuff on their website, like when Benjamin Persky smashed the windows. I think it was
yeah,
at Marsh. It's honestly, I'm not even saying I'm against these tactics morally. Like, I think, okay, I will say I'm against violence morally. I think anytime you hurt a sentient being, that's wrong. Don't do that. And I think that is a red line that we should never allow. But the research on nonviolence suggests, in terms of strategy and effectiveness, even perceptions of violence are extremely problematic for maintaining the moral high ground. So if the public perceives your actions as violent, so like smashing a window, Benjamin Persky, who's an activist in the United States. Did you know Benjamin, or did you hear about him?
I know of
He was,
Benjamin. Yeah, no,
yeah.
but
So
that's what I mean.
Benjamin, Josh Schwartz was a friend of mine in college. who I actually didn't even know he had served prison time until like 2 years after I met him. And honestly scared me. I was like, because I was such a law-abiding, good little kid when I met Josh. And I thought like, oh, Josh is just another vegan. And it's like, this is such a cool thing. Josh is always bringing vegan food and he's so smart. And then I learned he had served a year in jail, or prison actually, in Rikers, which is a hardcore prison in New York, for the SHAC campaign. I was honestly a little scared of him. I was like, oh my God, I can't even talk to him. But, but whatever my feelings at the time were, currently my position today, and honestly my position even back then, if I had reflected on it, was what they're doing is not ethically wrong. They smashed a window. That is different than punching a Beagle puppy. But, and here's the big but, in terms of public perception, that is perceived as violent because people see that and think, you smashed that window, you could smash me too. You could smash my father or my sister or my little kid. And for us as activists, we're grounded in compassion. It is so important from my point of view that we symbolically show the public, especially when we're doing really radical stuff, that everything we're doing is motivated by compassion. So my view is that the reason the ACLU and the Humane Society turned at least on the US activists is because they were posting things, honestly, like what Benjamin did, honestly, wasn't even that bad compared to some of the stuff they posted. Did you hear about the panty raid?
Yeah, that was not okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah,
So
there was
I don't
some
even
action
remember.
that weren't
Yeah,
okay.
not the best action. And actually, you have to confess, I don't remember if they actually posted this on the website, but I think they did.
They
I
did.
think,
There's the reason they posted it on the website is they were given legal advice
yeah,
that
that.
if they were going to post about beagles being liberated from hunting and life sciences, but
Mhm.
not about things like that, or what Benjamin Persky did, broken windows, or trashed cars or whatever,
Mhm.
then they were essentially advocating some illegality and not others. Whereas if they
Interesting.
just presented themselves as a news clearinghouse and they just posted
Yep.
everything connected to this campaign in any way,
Okay.
then they would be legally protected. Clearly, that was terrible legal advice,
Yeah.
but that
No,
was
they
the
got a lot of terrible legal advice all the way through the case, for
yeah.
sure. Yeah, and I was actually in law school and then a young law professor, and I was working on Lauren's support after she was convicted. Because to be honest, the first time I met Lauren and a lot of the SHAC people, I mean, I think all of them seem very impressive. They all seem crazy to me too, to be honest. but 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 that's partly because even within the vegan community, there was this internalization of meekishness, of we didn't have confidence in our own beliefs. We didn't really believe in anti-speciesism, even within the vegan community. And I think that's still true today. That if you really believe in anti-speciesism, then when someone's punching a Beagle puppy in the face, we should act in the same way as if they're punching a child in the face and say, look, no, look, nothing against you, but I'm going to stop you physically if necessary. You do not have the right to punch that child in the face, whether the child is a dog or a human. And
Yeah.
and back then, even though I, intellectually I'd read Peter Singer's book, I thought, yes, I'm an anti-speciesist, I'm a vegan. I thought of myself as a morally praiseworthy person. I wasn't actually drawing the correct moral implications of what I think is logically and ethically correct, which is all animals are equal. And the implication of that, if all animals are equal, is we have to act as if they're equal, including in our activism. But strategically, I still think it's so important, and this is kind of a big part of what I tried to do over the last 15 years, to when we're doing direct action and more quote unquote radical tactics, is show the world as compellingly as possible. I mean, carrying flowers in our hands, holding. I mean, I know peace signs are so goofy. Everyone kind of mocks us. We're like, oh, hey, peace and love, But I think it actually is important to do that stuff to show people we're not trying to hurt anybody. But I don't know. Maybe I'm
I
wrong.
think it's important now. I think it was a different. I think we had to toe the radical line because
Hmm.
people wouldn't listen.
One
Like
listen. Yeah.
if we had walked around
Okay.
like
With
if
peace
what
signs.
was it, like the biggest SHAC USA protest was Stevens Inc. in Arkansas, and how many was that, like 150 people or something?
I
And
don't
that's
know.
the biggest SHAC protest in the US
Yeah,
on
it
US
wasn't. It wasn't the
soil,
same size for sure.
right? And so 150 people walking around town with peace signs and flowers. Like, who gives a
Yeah.
shit?
Yeah.
But like the
Yeah.
protest they had, which turned into a police riot with like them firing rubber bullets and CS gas,
Hmm.
that ended up this multi-billion-pound corporation
Yeah.
dropped all connection to hunting life sciences almost immediately. Like, you don't take on billionaires with 150 people with flowers and peace signs. But I will say now the movement is very different. The world is different, and I think actually now you kind of have, and we have social media, and I think that there's a campaign currently in the UK. It's very new, but against MBR Acres, where Camp Beagle is, who breed 2,000 dogs a year for the research industry. They used to supply hunting life sciences. But a new campaign that's been going for 2 months, it's just focused on their suppliers. So it's taking the SHAC model, but it's so fluffy and public friendly. It's literally just, here are the suppliers, please send them a polite email, please write to them. But then it's doing the thing of looking at the suppliers, which are the secondary targets, but then the tertiary targets, which are the other customers of those suppliers, the kind of weak ones. And it's being incredibly effective, and it's being effective by essentially putting on social media a company logo, a sad dog, and this company kills puppies. And every single company pretty much is like, no, we don't like, take that down. We're not dealing. And in the last 2 months, MBR Acres, because of this entirely peaceful, lawful, mostly online activism, they've lost the company that collected their human waste from their sanitation system. They've lost the company that were dumping the dog waste. They've lost the gas supply company, the company that provided and serviced the vehicles that collected the dogs. The company that collected the dogs has just been evicted from their site. They've lost their bedding company. I mean, it goes on and on. I won't bore you with every single one, but this is in 2 months. They've lost like, a dozen suppliers or more. Just from this kind of activism, but taken out of that confrontational space. So I think we're in a very different world, and in some ways it can be quite exciting. Like, social media is a poison, but it can be used and channeled in really positive ways.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What's the name of the group?
It's MBR Suppliers.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that sounds awesome. Yeah, I want to put a pin in one subject, which is just whether pressure campaigns are strategically important for the movement, because it's actually pretty interesting. Lauren, of all people, has shifted dramatically away from pressure campaigns. And even, we did this, not even a very targeted pressure campaign against Whole Foods many years ago. And when she saw our first press release, she gave me a call and was yelling at me and saying, what are you doing? Because she shifted pretty dramatically in the direction of just cultural campaigns. That the goal is not to, that we didn't understand a broader strategic purpose of animal rights activism. We focused too much on the nitty-gritty details of trying to shut HLS down. The key goal of every campaign is to start cultural dialogue. And she's still very much in favor of provoking the bear if necessary. I mean, that's why she supports our work, is, we've provoked the bear too. Not as much as SHAC, but, I got out of jail a couple months ago, so I've had some unfortunate experience with the legal system as well. But her MO now is 100%, to the point that it's almost like extreme. I'm like, Lauren, it's okay to pressure this company a little bit, right? she's like, no, how dare you talk about Whole Foods? It's not about Whole Foods. It's about speciesism. It's about whether animals are things. It's like these bigger cultural issues. But I think honestly, we're diving a little bit too much into strategy, and I haven't given you a chance to tell your story.
That's fine. I do want to again, and maybe this is a slight difference again between SHAC USA and SHAC UK, but in the UK, every single time that we hit the headlines, and most of the time when we hit the headlines, it was not for the right reasons. And including when Brian Cass, he wasn't hit on the head with a baseball bat. He fell over and hit his head on a curb, which is people did. So
just one of the many lies the media tells. Yeah. Yeah, I think I'd heard that before. So yeah, I think I knew that.
He'd be dead if he was hit on the head with a baseball bat.
So can you just tell people who is Brian Cass, just so we all understand?
Brian Cass was the managing director of Hunting and Life Sciences throughout the period of the SHAC campaign. He was an asshole, and yeah.
But he did get attacked by some animal rights activists.
People jumped out at him with baseball bats. They may or may not have hit him around the body. I couldn't quite find that out, but certainly he slipped backwards and hit his head on the curb. And then the next day he was outside the laboratory, like, look, they hit me on the head with a baseball bat. Which, it goes from like an assault charge to an attempted murder charge, and and it was all part of demonizing us. And it was effective in many ways, but every time these things happened, support for the campaign, like financial support, membership, everything increased every single time. So in terms of cultural shifts and stuff, throughout the course of the SHAC campaign, support for animal testing consistently plummeted in the UK. So it didn't actually matter what we were doing. We were starting a conversation, and we didn't. I think maybe this is a bad thing in hindsight, but we didn't care what the public thought. Like, if you're going to help us close this place down, great, but otherwise get out the way, because we're closing them down, and then the next one, and then the next one, until we're done. So that was something. But also, in terms of the kind of cultural shifts and stuff, and maybe this is another thing being around people like Greg, but there was a point, because SHAC, HLS was meant to close within 3 years. And they actually technically closed within the first year of the campaign, but then were bailed out by the British government. And that wasn't, we didn't expect that. And then it kept happening. And there came a
Which
point.
was Labour, for the record. It wasn't the
It was
right.
Labour,
From what
yeah,
I
it was the
recall.
Labour
Tony
government.
Blair and Labour. So it was the left-wing party.
It was. And
Important
we
point.
have them back, and everyone else is excited apart from me because I remember what they
Yeah,
did to me last time.
I am saying this to Jeremy Loeb, one of my team members. I'm telling you, don't trust the liberals. I'm just kidding. There are some good liberals, but no. Okay, let's move on to the second point. But yeah, but the UK government bails them out. I'm just not a big fan of. I'm not a big fan of Biden, and it gets me in some trouble in the United States.
But yeah, the British government, the Labour government bailed out Hunting Life Sciences when they're about to close because they lost their bank account, they lost their loan from NatWest Bank, and when that happened, and then subsequent things that happened, they lost their insurance, and the British government bailed out their insurance, which is the first time. The British government have never given banking or insurance to a company before. So this is unprecedented. They bring out new laws, and there came a point where it became very apparent that, and even long after the SHAC 7 had gone to prison, this campaign carried on for another like 10 years here, and it became apparent that we were at a point where we were not going to stop, and they were not going to close. And we were almost fighting the government rather than this company. And I remember Greg, he launched a campaign. It was the Gateway to Hell campaign, which was aimed at the import and export of laboratory animals in and out of the UK, because we're an island. And if they can't get, wild caught primates into the UK, then they can't test on them. Yeah. And that affects the entire industry. So we did get caught in this thing, but then we kind of branched off and we're like, actually, we're going to keep SHAC as SHAC is going, but actually we're ready. Because, at some point, Hunting Life Sciences were going to close, and then one of their rivals, probably Covance, was going to buy them out. And then, we picked Hunting because they were low-hanging fruit. They were, after the investigations, their shareholders had left them, the customers had left them. So they were, a weak target. If Covance bought them out, then it was too big. So we were already focused on this Gateway to Hell campaign. So I think we were thinking more broadly, strategically, than just
one company.
Just this pressure campaign. And, and SHAC started because in theory, it was an easy win, and we proved
it was a strategically important target because it was a kind of low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, and then that would build up for the next one and the next one. But the next one was going to be the industry rather than the specific company.
Yeah, I do want to get back to your story because I'm just fascinated in your journey as well. And I actually don't know much about your journey. But before I jump to that, why do you think the UK government bailed SHAC out? Or not SHAC. I wish they had bailed SHAC out. By the way, we didn't just say what SHAC stands for. SHAC stands for Stop Hunting and Animal Cruelty. So that's the name of the campaign that was started by Greg and Natasha. And who was the third person again?
Heather.
Okay. Why am I'm so bad at animal rights history. I'm glad you're on the podcast to correct all my dumb errors. I'm very sorry, Heather. That's like not cool for me to leave you out. But for some reason, I think Greg and Natasha are just more famous, right? Is Heather less famous?
Maybe Heather got a longer set. Heather got 11 years for the campaign.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm just a terrible person then.
And everyone loves Heather. Like, no one has ever met Heather and not loved Heather. She's like the nicest person you could ever meet.
Is she still doing animal rights activism?
She's not active particularly at the moment. No, I think she has a lot going on with her legal stuff.
Yeah, I'm sorry. If I ever come through, I definitely want to meet you if I come through the UK. I'm actually not allowed to leave the country right now because I'm
not allowed into yours. So
yeah, well, this is the best we're going to do for now. I think at the end of my probation, I might be able to leave the country. But I'd love to meet all of these folks and just kind of hear more of their stories because there's so much received wisdom that I think one of the things that I've done that has been extraordinarily effective is just stay in touch with people who know a lot about the animal rights movement's history. Because I'm not saying you have to do exactly what everyone else has done, but there's a lot of what we do in the movement that is reinventing the wheel. Like, so for example, I met, I don't even know if I should say who this is, but I met someone recently who is mostly doing like cultivated meat stuff. And so I just didn't think of them as an animal rights activist. I just thought, like, I'm not that interested in the cult. I'm glad people are doing it, but it's not my thing. And I personally don't think it's as strategically important as some people do, because I feel like the meat substitutes we have are already great. And then I found out this person had done a right to know campaign. So right to know is this idea that one of the ways we get to change is just by forcing the legal system in this industry to show people the truth. And I don't think transparency is sufficient. I don't believe, the famous Paul McCartney line, if slaughterhouses had glass walls, everyone would be vegetarian. I don't think that's true. But I do think transparency is necessary. It doesn't get us all the way to animal liberation, but it's pretty important. And right to know is this idea that we should make a legal requirement that whether it's fur production, vivisection, or even meat in the grocery store, that every citizen that wants to know how this product was produced has the right to know. And we did this with our Whole Foods campaign in 2015. I thought this is some genius idea. We invented something really cool. And then I just found out someone had done this with the fur industry in the 1990s in LA and had been incredibly successful. I was like, oh, wait, I should have actually talked to these people who had done it 20 years earlier. And frankly, were more successful than we were. So there's so much that I think that is missed when we don't talk about the history of movements, because you just don't realize people have done things before and they might have been smarter than you. I mean, I've had that experience many times, just realizing, oh my God, these people did it before me and they were smarter than us. But unfortunately, the received wisdom from Greg and Natasha and Heather and you will have to happen by Zoom or email, because I'm not allowed in the UK. Now I'm completely forgetting what my train of thought was. I don't even remember what my train of thought was. But I did want to just ask you, do you remember where I was going?
No, but I did have a point that might give you time to
take your point. Do you think I'm the worst podcast host ever, or is this just an embarrassing individual performance? It's one or the other. This is either just an embarrassingly bad performance as a podcast host, or I'm just the worst podcast host in history. But no, make your point, and then I'll ask you about your personal story.
It just goes back to what you were saying earlier about, how SHAC attracted these, I guess, like great minds, these strategists and everything else. And I think,
including you, for the record, you were super fucking smart, dude.
But I think part of that, certainly in my knowledge around, pressure campaigning and strategy and things like that, that's because I spent time around Greg and the culture of SHAC and really the culture of the movement, but specifically SHAC was like, if you don't know how to do something, just learn.
Yeah.
Like we can all do anything. And so being so awesome in that environment is like, Tom, I need you to make a newsletter. Like you're doing the next copy of the SHAC newsletter. And I'm there like trying to work it out. And, we didn't have Google or anything back then. We just had to kind of work it out and ask advice. And so, I taught myself, or was, taught how to do newsletters. I was taught how to, find out companies, emails and phone numbers and director structures and, all these things. I was like a 18-year-old crusty punk reading the Financial Times. It was like, we were encouraged to learn. If you want to back up, mate, like I didn't know what 300 dots per inch meant when I first sent off my first leaflet to get printed and it came back all pixely, but we were encouraged to learn this stuff. And so I think that's a big part of it, is like it did attract people because we were a campaign that was winning, that was dynamic, and nothing inspires people like inspiration. If you show people something amazing, people want to be part of it, something that's going to win. That's what draws people in. So we were attracting these, these talented people, but also those talented people were being taught and encouraged to learn everything. Like I know how to do accounts. I know how to do all these things that I didn't, I didn't know when I was like dumpster diving and jumping trains and.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of that I think did have to do with just the DIY culture in the punk scene. Cause I mean, there was this weird intersection. I am totally not punk. I am, first time I went to a punk show, I literally like ran away in fear because I saw the moshing and I thought a fight had broken out. And I was like, oh my God, I need to get out of here. And I was like, oh, no, like come back. It's okay. It just called moshing. And I was like, moshing? Like, I was like, what's moshing? And I no, I'm actually quite serious. I left the show. I didn't run. I didn't literally like flee. Well, no, I did flee, but I didn't run out of the show. Yeah, I just came up, I set up my table and I was going to hand out leaflets. And then this thing happened in the crowd and I left. I was like, oh my God, there's a fight breaking out. I need to leave. This is, I'm a law student. I can't get in trouble. I was scared. And they're like, no, this is part of the show. I will say eventually I did eventually enter a mosh pit, and it turns out it's kind of fun. And the punk scene, especially back then, had this very powerful, like, swashbuckling DIY mentality. And it's actually really sad because I feel like the modern grassroots, I think especially on the left, has almost taken the opposite approach. And I don't know if it's social media or some weird cultural change in the left or just the death of music scenes like the punk scene. I don't think there are any big music scenes at all. I mean, the only big music scene out there now is Taylor Swift. And, I don't know if the Taylor Swift culture is one that's going to encourage people to take thoughtful risks and challenge themselves in the way they need to challenge themselves. But it was pretty impressive to me just how much of an attitude of let's figure this out there was in the early 2000s. And that's something, even though I wasn't punk at all and I didn't understand the music, I didn't understand moshing, it was extremely attractive to me to be around these people because they're always trying to figure stuff out. And even the birth of SHAC USA was because of that DIY mentality, because Kevin came to the UK, and I think did you know Kevin Jonas?
I know Kevin. I've never met him in person. I missed
Okay,
him when he came over here, but
because you came in later after he had already left.
yeah, I know his
Is that right?
husband,
Okay.
Eric.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Kevin's husband's. Oh, by the way, Kevin's husband's amazing. They're both amazing human
Yeah,
beings, but they're really just kind and incredibly
yeah,
smart people, and huge loss to the movement. Kevin Jonas, again, was the president of SHAC USA. But what happened to you happened to Kevin too. He basically came to the UK to hang out with the activists, learned a bunch of stuff, then brought it to the USA and built a movement that was among the most powerful, maybe the single most powerful grassroots movement in US history. Well, grassroots animal rights movement, I should say. Um, so I don't know. Do you agree with me that there's something that's changed in the grassroots with respect to like DIY attitude and just willingness to learn?
Yes, I think it's easy to fall into kind of like normalizing our culture. So what's happening in
Mm,
America, what's happening in the UK. I've literally just got back from a small animal liberation gathering in the Netherlands, and it was the first time in a very long time I felt like properly amongst my people, because there actually are like,
wow.
crusty street punk kind of people,
Hmm.
like squatters, and but
Oh.
people who are like active and
Hmm.
like strategizing and all of that. And yeah, that was very nice for me, because yeah, I mean, the grassroots in England, I mean, and it's not coincidental. What happened to SHAC was, in the words of, actually, this comes back to one of your other questions earlier that I didn't get around to answering, but um, what the science minister during SHAC was called Lord Sainsbury's, and he, in a secret meeting with the pharmaceutical industry, said that he was going to eliminate our movement by the end of
Mm,
that year, and that was just before we ended up getting rounded up. And the SHAC campaign was just part of it. It started with the New Church Guinea Pig campaign that was trying to close down a guinea pig breeder. Then it moved to Sequani campaign, who were trying to close down another laboratory in the west of England. Then it came to SHAC, and then it went to the Speak campaign with Mel Broughton, who was trying to close down a Oxford university laboratory, primate laboratory. And then it went to Austria, and actually they failed over there, like eventually after a big high profile court case. So it was a very like root and branch approach. And the movement at the time was mostly focused on animal testing, because
mm-hmm,
at the time it was winnable. It was a big target
mm-hmm,
to get rid of animal testing, but vegans made up like 0 point something% of the population. Like, we weren't going to get rid of animal agriculture.
mm-hmm.
When we talked about, the vegan revolution, we imagined an actual bloody violent revolution. We couldn't see how else that was going to come about in our lifetime. But we were like, if we can make these big changes, if we can get rid of animal testing, we can get rid of fur, we can get
Mm-hmm.
rid of hunting, then we're pushing society in the right direction, so
Russia,
that the
yeah.
next generation can pick this up. So that was kind of, I think, how most of us viewed it. So when they took out the anti-vivisection movement, they took out the animal liberation movement. We still had,
Mm-hmm,
the hunt saboteurs, the badger cull activists, but everything else was gone.
mm-hmm,
And really, since then, we haven't. But aside from the wildlife issues, we haven't had a grassroots movement for a very long time in this country, and it's
mm.
starting to come back now. But it's
Animal
so.
Rising, baby.
I would argue, I'm very close friends with most of the organizers of Animal Rising, and I absolutely love them. I would argue that they're not a grassroots organization, and they would
Interesting.
strongly argue against it.
Yeah,
But
that
but I
I hear
think
Ben Newman and Dan Kidney and Rose Patterson screaming in my ear
they will be screaming in
right
my
now.
face the next time I
Object
talk
to
to
everything
them.
Tom is saying right now.
I think they do amazing work. I think their general structure, and I know, that there's things they're changing about it and working on with it. But and there's this isn't a criticism
Yeah,
of them. Like, I think what they do is amazing and essential for our
it is
movement. But
amazing. Yeah.
but their change, it really is a top down change. The donation
Mm,
model is top down. The organization is top down. Literally everything. Like, there's
yeah.
no one on the bottom is lifting it up. I mean, the three people you mentioned, they've all risen themselves up from the bottom, but the
Yep.
actual organizational structure, I would argue, certainly isn't what I would
Called
classically define
grassroots.
as the grassroots animal
Interesting.
liberation movement.
That's not how
For
they
me,
started, from what I understand. They started, with much less structure than they have now, and it used to
yeah,
be much more. So, do you think there was a change made in Animal Rising to make it less grassroots, or not grassroots, or do you think originally wasn't? I mean, I'm just
I,
not that familiar with animal
I don't
rebellion.
feel it's ever been a grassroots movement.
Interesting.
Personally,
Okay.
it's a very important movement, and it's a very interesting break for me. And it's entirely possible and probably likely that I'm misusing my definition of
Of
grassroots.
grassroots.
But
Yeah.
the movement I grew up in, the grassroots movement was your local animal rights group. So we
Mm-hmm.
would have maybe monthly meetings. We'd all get together. You would normally have someone or someone's kind of coordinating the meetings, and generally, like, should we do a
Yep.
protest? But it would be the group that would decide,
Yeah. What you're doing.
this is what
Yeah.
we're going to do. And so, we might have a local oceanarium or local fur retailer or butchers or whatever, and be like, yeah, that's our target. We're going to close them down, or we're going to cause disruption, or we're just going to do whatever. But it was up to the local groups would decide.
Yeah.
And then you'd have the national campaigns. Like, and I suppose you had two types of national campaigns. You had the ones like Animal Aid and Viva that, and again, I'm probably going to upset friends now, but at the time, I didn't really feel like they did or achieved very much. Certainly things that I think have shifted now, but at the time, they felt fairly redundant. Then you had the welfareists that were felt like a different movement, to be honest. And in hindsight, actually, we're probably doing more system change and inside game playing than the national groups, and certainly more than I recognized at the time. But they,
in a good way, that sounds like a positive thing from your perspective.
I think as I've got older and potentially wiser, I kind of I have more scope.
Oh my God, Tom Harris, you're becoming a moderate. You're becoming a
I'm happy for others to exist in that
I'm going to
way.
start calling you a conservative. Tom Harris has become a conservative.
Animal rights,
he's a welfare. We didn't actually describe what Animal Rising is. So let me just explain what Animal Rising is. Animal Rising is an animal rights organization in the UK that is, I guess, known initially for an animal rebellion that was accompanying Extinction Rebellion. That I don't know how many people started with the Animal Rebellion, but it was certainly hundreds. I don't know if it was thousands because I wasn't there. And they have used arrest as a tactic. There are at least hundreds of people have been arrested for animal rights in acts of civil disobedience. And more recently, the shift they made recently that I love, which, unsurprising that I love it because I do a lot of this myself, is open rescue. They've done a ton of open rescues, including openly rescuing 18 beagles from Marshall. And I think they just got charges filed against them a couple months ago for that open rescue. But you're right that there is more structure in hierarchy and Animal Rising, from what I understand, than, for example, certainly like in the SHAC campaign, the local group wasn't even SHAC. It was just like, for us in Chicago, it was called ADL Chicago. Do you remember the Animal Defense League? Did you?
So all across the UK, we had every town or city, and probably and the same in America, you'd have your local animal rights group that focus on local issues. And when something like SHAC came up, all these groups would provide it. And so this is the differentiation for me with when you read about Animal Rising in the newspaper, that's because Animal Rising have organized an action. Whereas when you read about SHAC in the newspaper, the coordinators of SHAC 9 times out of 10 didn't know what was going to appear in the newspaper about them because they hadn't organized it. Like some local group in Plymouth or Liverpool or Stockport had organized this action.
And that was true of direct action everywhere too, for the record. I had no idea what the hell was going on. Everyone always, well, they gave me credit for things I didn't even know were going to happen, but they blamed me for things I didn't know were going to happen. I was like,
welcome to the club.
Especially the political stuff. I no one knows this, but the political stuff, I always hated it when activists did that. I was like, oh my God, do you have to disrupt Bernie Sanders? Like, Bernie of all people, Bernie. But people just wanted to do it. And I was like, all right, you're going to do it. As long as it's nonviolent, we're going to share it, And so that was, and DXC structure changed a lot too. And we might be geeking out a little too much on organizational structure, because I actually think the hierarchy that DXC created starting in 2017 and 2018, which I left shortly after we created more hierarchy because, for a variety of reasons, maybe partly because I was just a terrible leader. So when we created hierarchy, everyone realized, oh, actually, we want hierarchy. We just don't want that guy leading us. No, I don't think it wasn't like that. People were very happy, and they were actually kind of sad that I left. But I just didn't think it was the right place for me. But for the first 4 or 5 years, it was like straight up, you guys do whatever the hell you want. And I think one of the reasons Animal Rising does what it does, and one of the reasons DXC created more hierarchy, is I think local groups have kind of just disappeared. There really aren't these local groups anymore. When I was coming up as an activist in the early 2000s, and even as late as the early 2010s, there were tons of little local groups that were doing all sorts of random stuff. And you could plug them in and say hey, here's something you could do on vivisection, on fur, whatever it is. And so even when we had incredibly, so by the mid to late 2010s, so we passed a ban on fur in San Francisco in 2017. And then in 2018 and 2019, we passed a ban on fur in the state of California, which is a huge victory. It's 40 million people. I don't remember the exact amount of money, but I think it was like almost $1 billion in sales in California. Because even though California's got warm weather, it's also the biggest fashion state in the nation. So there's a lot of fur being sold in California. And we wiped it out, all gone overnight. Every fur farm was closed down. I mean, granted, a lot of them shifted to doing other stuff. So it's like a little messed up. So like the rabbit farm started selling rabbit meat. And so it's not all, but it's still, no one
Yeah,
can contest. This is a huge
yeah.
victory. So we just created a bunch of template documents and said like, all right, now Grassroots, go do it everywhere. And like no one picked it up. There's like one group in Minneapolis that said, all right. And I felt like we had this cookie cutter project that you could just take and you could ban it in your local city. You could ban it in a village. You could ban it at your university. You could just take all our materials and do whatever you want with them. And there was only one group that picked it up in Minneapolis. Actually, there was another group in Portland like a couple years later, but there was only one group initially that picked it up. And it was pretty shocking to me because, I grew up at a time where if someone gave me like a bunch of folders and documents and plans based on a campaign they had won in a state like in California and said like, yeah, this worked, you should do this, I would have been like, oh my God, this is like gold. I was happy when someone sent me a leaflet. I was so excited when like PETA sent me leaflets. It was my best day. I was like, oh my God, I don't have to make my own leaflets like in my crappy ass font and with my terrible design skills. And there's something that's changed. It relates to what I was saying earlier about the DIY attitude of the punk community in the animal rights in the early 2000s, in that I just think there's less initiative at the local level compared to the early 2000s.
There is, and I don't think it's entirely down to like a cultural change. I think it is down to the fact that people haven't got that mentorship, they haven't got that passing down knowledge. Because what happened to SHAC when we were taken out and the movement was effectively ended. That was the first break in this passing down of knowledge for like 60 years. Like the knowledge I have been directly given by people like Greg, by people like Don Curry, like by people like Keith Matt, like this knowledge goes straight back to like Ronnie Lee and the birth of the Animal Liberation Front. Like,
yeah.
And then suddenly it just stops with us going to jail and people like, withdrawing from the movement. And there's just a stop. And then the new movement, like you say, Animal Rising particularly, but others, DXE, Animal Save, We the Free, all these new groups that have come, a lot of them kind of came more from the environmental space and certainly like tactically, strategically, rather than our history. Because we weren't there to give it to them. That's on us. And that, that's particularly on the people that were there that could have done it, that chose not to be involved in the movement anymore. And it is what it is, but there's a huge knowledge gap that kind of needs filling. And part of that is this whole idea of local groups. And I think it's very easy to kind of, there's very small things with it from the history of our movement that seem quite unimportant. But actually, like that local group network was everything. And without it, we are a weaker movement. So my main focus actually at the moment is rebuilding that local group network in the UK. And it, I've only started it, and me and my partner Nicola, we've started it in our local town, and it's going remarkably well. We haven't started a new group. We have a new group. It's actually the group I joined here 20-something years ago, but it's an umbrella. And so we've invited everyone. So we have the local We the Free chapter, we have the local NARD group, we have the local Save and plant-based treaties, plant-based councils, 3 different hunt saboteur groups, the Palestine actionists, the anarchist prison supporters, the sanctuaries. We have like everyone we could get together that is active locally, because we all have a stake. If we can build a mass movement, we have this vision, we can have 1,000 people active in our area, and we can. And if we get that, then that means our local We the Free chapter can have hundreds of people on every outreach, and SABs can have hundreds of people on every SAB. And so everyone has the buy-in. And then when we sat around in this room, we had these, 30 or so people sat around in this room, just going through, saying, who introduce themselves, what they do. And you could see, people who do outreach all the time were like, wait, what's hunt sabbing again? That sounds amazing. And then you have people that go hunt sabbing, like maybe every now and then I can have a day off and go and do some outreach.
What's hunting?
Right,
hunting. What is hunting?
Why do vigils happen? And actually, that kind of face-to-face interaction with the victims of this industry is so important for not just radicalizing, but kind of cementing you in, you've made a personal connection with someone that you can't save, and nothing radicalizes you like that. So all of these things, people, chatting, and after this first meeting, like We the Free had 15 new signups, the Hunt Sabs had 15 new signups, like the Vigils had 15 new signups. So people want to be more active, they just don't know how or where. And this group's spawned new local pressure campaigns against our Oceanarium, against the Dorset Country Show, and it's been super effective. And yeah, so my focus is on rolling that out nationally, essentially, and kind of
Yeah.
going to local areas where there are
Beautiful.
existing groups and building them up. And so I think
Yeah.
that's very important, and that is a
That
huge
is
part
so
of our movement.
important.
So
Yeah.
so I hope it's effective, and I hope it
Yeah.
works.
The social scientific research shows this too, that powerful movements are start from the bottom up. That there's, and it's funny because everyone is so focused on national politics, especially in the United States. And even Ezra Klein. So Ezra Klein is a very prominent vegan columnist. He's among the most important journalists in the entire nation. You know, he interviewed Nancy Pelosi recently. He interviewed Tim Walz, and one of the reasons Tim Walz was selected as VP was probably that interview of Ezra Klein. And Ezra Klein's a vegan and anti-species. I know him. I've done it. He's done on my podcast. I've done on his podcast. Really great guy. And Ezra Klein has said, because the science shows us for years, that local politics is actually where most change happens. I don't know why people don't do more in local politics, but everything he writes about is in national politics. So I feel like politics and activism, partly because of social media, has become just theater. It's like theater all the way down. I mean, there's an element of theater that's important for activism. Like you have to understand how to harness narrative and attention and drama to get eyeballs, but it can't be theater all the way down. And it has become theater all the way down in the sense that even in the underlying strategy and the underlying mission of the organization, there's nothing in the real world we're trying to change. It's all just about eyeballs and tweets and theater. And and to me, the best example of this is the focus on national politics. Anytime someone talks about Biden, and I'm guilty of this too, because I talked about Biden already a couple of times, or Trump or Kamala, to me, that's not even activism. That's not politics. That's cosplaying. That's some sort of dance you're doing. You know, like, oh, I like to dance. You know, it's like you realize dancing on some stage is not actually real. That's just a dance. And that's what national politics is. And the real change happens at the local level. And this is true, whatever your issues, whether you're concerned about fentanyl or, I actually learned recently, Rose was telling me apparently there isn't like a big fentanyl problem in the UK. Is that true? That's so weird to me.
Yeah, no, there isn't.
That's so weird. Cause like I live in San Francisco and I mean, literally every time I go on the street, sorry, this is totally orthogonal. So I don't know why. I told you I'm the worst podcast host in history, but there's some
We have
things the
such a
UK is
lack of problem. I don't even know what fentanyl is.
really. Oh my God. There are like 100,000 people dying. I mean, every time I walk on the streets of San Francisco, there's all these like zombies. It's really sad. All these people addicted to fentanyl, just like careening into the street and like, shitting themselves on the sidewalk because it's so bad. There's so many people addicted to fentanyl. But the point is, whatever your issue is, you got to start locally. So here's what I think the problem is. And then I do want to get to your story because this is too interesting. So Jeremy was right. Like, actually, Jeremy initially was like, hey, you should have this guy. And I have to confess, I had heard about you, but I was like, I don't know who Tom Harris is. And because, I mean, okay, now I'm going to admit I'm cosplaying too, because a lot of what we've been trying to do on our YouTube show is we have to hit our metrics. And like, because you're not a big YouTuber and you don't have like a big social media, I was like, should we have him? Because, when we have James Aspie or Vegan Gains on, we get like 3,000, 4,000 clicks and, and attention does matter. But then I listened, he was like, oh, I actually really want to have this conversation with this guy. Cause I was like, this is really great. Cause I just listened to you and I just realized it'd be a fun conversation. And that's proven to be true. I know, and it's too bad we can't meet in person because it would be really fun to hang out. And I'm going to prove to you, even though I'm not a crust punk, I am one of your people. I promise you. Because that's not for me to assess. That's actually for you to assess. What am I talking about? But here's the problem with the local organizing. One is back in the early 2000s and late 90s, there just were more local groups. And I just think, people like you can build something locally, but in terms of the bigger network, there just aren't as many local groups as there used to be. There aren't, and this is not just true of animal rights. This is true of environmentalism. This is true of homelessness. This is true of everything. Everything has become like weirdly nationalized, and it's not just corporations that have become big and centralized. It's like all of society. And there's this great book called Bowling Alone by a sociologist at Harvard named Robert Putnam. And it's just about the decline in civic organizations in American life. And this is not just true of the United States. It's true of societies around the world. Everybody's just sitting at home on Instagram and TikTok watching videos. They don't get out there and join a bowling club or like have a hiking group or a running club or whatever it is. Everyone's just like, I honestly think it's underappreciated how much damage video games have caused to global culture. Because this is especially true in Asia, where it's like honestly scary when I look at my cousins in Asia and like their classmates, how much time they just sit playing video games. And video games, they're like an incredibly insidious but incredibly efficient technology at addicting people. Have you played video games at all? Have you ever been addicted to a video game?
I know my limits.
Yeah,
I
good. So
occasionally
you could cut it
I
off.
struggle to. It's something I'd like to do more, to be honest, but I don't have time, and there's other
Really?
things I'd rather do more. Yeah,
What
yeah,
games
I'm
do
a
you
bit of a
play?
nerd. Kind of, I tend to stick to ones that I know I can turn off. So things like
Oh,
Zelda
interesting.
and
Okay, cool. So those are like
Grand Theft.
discrete games, not like World of Warcraft or yeah,
I wouldn't like. Yeah, I
yeah.
don't trust myself.
Oh
I
no,
have
World of
important
Warcraft
things
is
to
the
do
end of so
outside.
many people's lives. Like it's like
Yeah,
destroy. I'm not even kidding. I've seen like relationships, families that have fallen apart. I think it's underappreciated how much video games, because video gaming is a bigger industry than movies now. It's like huge, and especially among young men. A lot of the reason you have all these alienated, disconnected young men is because all they do is play video games all day. But so part of the problem is you don't have these organizations at all. They just don't exist because people are playing video games or they're on TikTok or whatever it is. But the other problem with local organizing that I've seen is so we did have all these local chapters initially, and oftentimes they weren't even DXC chapters, just like some, like you said, just some local group, like the Chicago Coalition for Animal Rights did some demonstrations for us, and there was some, I can forget the name of the group in Phoenix, but it was a really cute name, like something involving puppies or something like that. But the other problem is with modern social media culture, any fight that erupts between various groups, and it doesn't even have to be, related to whatever the organizing campaign. So like, I'll give you a concrete example. In I think it was 2015, we'd just done a bunch of open rescues, gotten national attention. We started doing these trainings over the world, and a lot of people were really fired up to do these open rescues, and we're building a lot of momentum. And then there was this huge fight that erupted between two chapters. One was in Vancouver, and I think the other was in LA. Nothing to do with us in the Bay Area at all, about racism. These fights have always existed. I mean, people fought about these things in the early 2000s too. But in this case, especially because, George Floyd happened in 2020, but in the grassroots progressive scene, you know, our moment was Michael Brown. Like when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, that became like a huge issue for everyone. And everyone who was an activist in any movement, environmentalism, gay rights, whatever it is, anti-racism became such an important thing. And there was a lot of merit to that. Like racism was a huge problem in American society. I'm sure it's a problem in the UK too. And so it was good that we were having these conversations. But the way these conversations were unfolding, what happened for us, I think it was in 2015, maybe it was in 2016, was one of the organizers in LA for whatever the LA group was. I don't even think it was DXC LA, but the group in Vancouver was definitely DXC Vancouver. An organizer in LA posted a meme just comparing civil rights activists to animal rights activists. Like basically, it was a picture of civil rights activists in Greensboro, North Carolina, basically getting food dumped on their head when they were doing sit-ins, and then a picture of activists in the United States, like doing a sit-in in some grocery store or restaurant, just protesting animal abuse. And you could say whatever you want about that, but the intention was a good intention. They weren't trying to appropriate Black culture, or they were trying to show like, hey, it's the same. But we had a chapter in Vancouver that said, this is white supremacy. This is completely racist. Not only did they say we had to say what they're doing is wrong and tell them to take it down, which we did do. We said like, yeah, this is because, and the argument basically is, look, this is kind of like activism cosplaying. The civil rights activists were actually murdered. The victims in the animal rights case are not us, right? It's the animals. And yeah, occasionally we get roughed up a little bit, but there's not like a mass system of vegan segregation where all the vegans have to like sit in different lunch counters. All the vegans can't go to schools that the non-vegans go to. Like we're not the victims. And so there was a pretty important difference between the civil rights activists who were themselves victims of oppression and animal rights activists who are getting yelled at or even pushed around when we're doing a protest. So it wasn't like, it wasn't the perfect comparison, but it was done with good intention. And it wasn't, the guy who did it is a white person, but he's actually like, he was super supportive of Black Lives Matter. And he like thought he was doing something good for civil rights activists. And it became this explosive conflict where both sides dug their heels in. And instead of organizing around open rescue and trying to cultivate, more power and training and knowledge and trying to transmit whatever skills I had, I spent like months just mediating these conflicts. And that has become an enormous problem that, again, it existed in the early 2000s too, but it is like 10 or 100 times worse now. And it gives me it's one of the reasons I don't even know if it's possible, unless there's some big cultural shift in grassroots movements. I don't know if it's possible for you to have like these disparate, decentralized networks, because so much of your time ends up being consumed by people attacking each other and fighting with each other.
I think, I mean, that comes from a centralized perspective, though, doesn't it? That's you managing what other people are doing. If they're doing it amongst themselves and they get on and do it amongst themselves, I think a huge part of the problem is, as one of the other things we've lost, isn't just the local grassroots movement and the network. It's also the face-to-face interactions that came with it. So it's the local group meetings where all the local groups can come together. And like I say, we had like people in that room. We had the reason we have 3 different hunt saboteur groups locally is because they often don't get on with each other very well, and they keep leaving to start new ones. But they were all there, they were all represented, and they're all talking, and everyone's civil and everyone's nice because it's face-to-face, and you can understand nuance.
Huge difference.
And you can realize that people aren't out to get you. Different people have different ideas. And my personal take, and we talk about research on social movements, every successful social movement has been a diverse ecosystem. You need the inside game, you need the outside game, you need the radical front, you need all of it. And so we're all playing a part. And when you can get people together and they can start to realize that this person might be on a different path, but we're headed in the same direction. And actually there's things they're doing that might be useful. Like the hunt saboteurs can identify where farms are and who's in them. And they can pass that on to farm investigators, who can pass the footage on to We the Free, who can pass their signatures back to the local group to build our mailing list and bring more people into it. So we can work together. We don't need to be working apart. And you get that from face-to-face interaction. You don't get that on social media. And then a level up from that, then you start talking about having like national animal, we used to have the Animal Rights Coalition in the UK, but if you have these national forums for representatives of each of these groups to come together, and they used to move around the country, so you'd get all the people from the southwest at one time or the north or whatever, and you get all the organizers of the bigger campaigns together and the local group organizers, and they can discuss things amongst themselves. And people might disagree, people might fall out, there might be a fight sometimes, but generally people will listen to each other and understand in a way that social media just does not facilitate. And then you go bigger and you have the international gatherings we used to have, and people come from around the world, and not conferences, not like donor hookups or whatever, like actual gatherings, trainings where people can learn self-defense, they can learn investigation skills and strategy skills and all the rest of it. But people coming together as a meeting of minds and a meeting of ideas. And actually at the Dutch gathering I went to this weekend, it was very much like that. And one of the talks was deliberately provocative. It was a workshop on anarchism in animal liberation, and it was deliberately, basically just asking questions, throwing questions to the audience about hierarchical structures, about donations, about whether the activists should be paid. Things that were deliberately, the person running it is clearly an anarcho-activist, and they wanted to make people think. And what was kind of beautiful to me about it, I kind of sat on the edge and watched it, was that you had people that are working for like the Dutch Animal Rights Political Party there. You had people from SAVE, you had people from these big organizations, and then you also had these anarchist activists there. And they're answering these questions, and they're talking to each other, and they're thinking about what each other are saying. And some people are strongly disagreeing, but they're not fighting about it. They're thinking about, oh, actually, maybe that is a point. And you get that from face to face. So that's something we need to bring back into our movement, is these face-to-face meetings with people. And for me, that just starts with the local meetings. Just like arrange a meeting in your local town and see who turns up, and it will grow. And that's where we build our movement back from, and that's how we lose it. Because as you say, we've always had those arguments, and we had it with SHAC. People, Greg was a divisive character. A lot of people didn't like him because he was so focused on SHAC and closing Huntingdon. And like I say, he was more strategically aware than that, but that was his focus. And people would come along and like dripping out of the campaign, and people rubbed up along against him a lot because he was working 24/7 on this, and people that weren't kind of like trying to push their ideas or whatever. And so a lot of people left SHAC disillusioned, but because they didn't have social media to go and sit in a corner and vent on, they either just vanished or they go and set up their own campaign. And actually built our movement. And I think now social media, it just fosters this idea that we should all just be. But I think a part of that as well is that people don't have anything to do. I think we have broadly, we have 2 types of activism at the moment, notwithstanding the small pop-up pressure campaigning. And those are the one hand you have, groups like Camp Beagle, and again, we need
Hmm.
everything and everyone, and everyone's doing great work. And I think what Camp Beagle are doing, keeping a spotlight on animal testing, is essential, and that's why this grassroots is rebuilding in this country. But in terms of getting involved in Camp Beagle, most people involved in Camp Beagle, and around the world, there's like thousands and thousands of people that supporters of Camp Beagle. But for most
Hmm.
people, it's almost like voyeuristic activism. It's like following them on social media and seeing what they're up to.
Yeah.
And there's no
Can you just
big call.
describe what Camp Beagle is for people who don't know?
Yeah, so Camp Beagle is I think it's the world's longest running anti-vivisection protest camp outside of MBR Acres, who breed 2,000
Hmm.
dogs a year for the research industry here. Owned by Marshall BioResources, who are
Hmm.
US based. But yeah, they've been there for 3 years, and they don't really have a big call to action. They're not asking particularly other people to do anything specific. So
Hmm.
that's one type of activism we have, and then the other type is organizations like you say, like Animal Rising and Save, and most of the big organizations that, unless you're a local coordinator, for most people it's turn up at this time on this day, sometimes dress like this, do this, these are like how this is how you do an action, and then go away for a week and then not really think about it and come back a week later. And again, those actions are great and essential and a vital part of our movement, but they're not encouraging that kind of autonomy and that kind of that space to kind of be creative and recognize your own
Hmm.
agency, which is, for me, that's one of the main reasons I think pressure campaigns are actually really important and not just
Yeah, because
strategic.
they give you, yeah.
They give, for me, like, I don't have a political background. I don't have friends in politics. I'm not a scientist. But I can change, I could close down a company the size of Huntington Life Sciences, just me and my
Yeah.
friends. Like, that's remarkable. And I can do that with basically no resources. I can do that without any specific education. And there's no bigger way, I don't think, that we can recognize our own power as individuals than through pressure campaigning, and then by looking these people in the eye and these industries in the eye and
Hmm.
saying, like, no, like, you're blinking first. So that, for me, that's why they're so important. And when we have those pressure campaigns, it gives people something to do, because
Hmm.
you'll wake up and you'll be like, oh, like, the campaign's still going, what should I do today? Should I put some stickers? Should I, like, get the super glue out? Should I hand out some
Hmm.
flyers? Should I get some chalk doing? Like, should I make a banner? Should I do some research? And people, like, invest in that, and they have something to do. So even if you fall out with someone organizing that campaign or this campaign, it's like, well, I don't have time because I got to get this going.
Hmm.
And so I think
Hmm.
giving people those tools and that knowledge and that experience to be able to just take action whenever and however you want, I
Yeah.
think, and this is yet to be proven, but I think that would go a long way to stopping a lot of the kind of online
Yeah. Infighting.
back
Interesting.
and forth.
So you, so I guess the theory then is that there's something about the clarity of focus on a pressure campaign that gives people some sort of structure, a decentralized structure to organize their activism and develop their skills. Is that kind of your take?
Partly, and I think it's also just the fact, and if it's a proper grassroots pressure campaign, then you're literally asking people to do what needs to be done. And obviously, SHAC was a lawful campaign in the UK,
Hmm.
and so, like, you can set kind of broad guidelines. So, even the Animal Liberation Front has like a set of guidelines that people have to adhere to,
Hmm.
including nonviolent. So yeah, you can kind of create like a kind of system in which people can operate, but you're encouraging people to take action, and a lot of that is take an inspiring photo on a protest. If you have a photo of
Hmm.
someone on a roof, then people will get onto roofs. I remember there was one of the SHAC campaigns was against the Shell Oil Company because they tested plasticizers on animals inside Huntingdon. And on that edition of the SHAC newsletter, two activists just climbed onto the roof of a Shell petrol station, like early hours of the morning before it opened, just got a
Hmm.
photo of them with a banner up and came straight down. But that was the cover.
Hmm.
And literally, like 2 days later, every single petrol station, like Shell petrol station, had
Had
people on the
people.
roof
Wow.
doing like banners and stuff, because seeing stuff like that inspires you. Like,
Yeah.
oh, and
Yeah.
we fostered this kind of this friendly competition. And particularly,
Yep.
my group in Bournemouth, it was the Liverpool group were our competition, and we'd see like they've got on a roof, they've done chained
Mhm.
themselves to a
We got to do
minibus.
this
Like,
too.
what can we do that's better than that? We need to do something
Yeah.
better, and then it grew. So I think kind of creating those kind of situations where people want to be autonomous and can be autonomous, and kind of
Yeah.
framing it around that, I think is powerful, and that comes from the pressure campaigning, because if you're asking a politician to make a change for you, you're deferring all of your agency to someone else. If you're signing a petition, you're deferring your agency to someone else. And also, in my opinion, if someone is telling you this is the next protest, this is how it will be, this is where it will be, and you don't get an
Mhm.
input into that, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I think it starts to slowly erode this idea of autonomy and personal agency. And I think that's
Yeah.
so important. I think if we want to see real change, then every
Yeah.
single vegan, every single activist needs to understand that each of us has the power to change the world. Every single one of
Yeah.
us. And together we can fucking change everything.
Yeah. Hell yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to say one thing strongly in support of what you said, and then one thing that questions what you said. The thing that's strongly in support is, sorry to always refer to social science, but this is who I am. I was a geek when I started doing activism. I'm still a geek today. I actually never, honestly, I never thought I'd ever organize a protest. I just thought, oh, that's for other people. I mean, I was, I was a professor and a law student and PhD student when I got involved in animal rights activism. And I just thought, again, I thought people like Lauren are crazy. I was like, what? Those are the activists. I'm just so, but I do still think that research is valuable. And there's this concept in sociological research called strategic capacity. Have you heard of this concept? You could
No.
probably guess what it is, but so it's a concept coined by a PhD and a sociologist at Harvard named Marshall Gantz, who incidentally was himself an organizer before he went to grad school. He organized with the farm workers and Cesar Chavez in the 1970s. And the idea behind strategic capacity is so for decades, these centralized unions had been trying to organize farm workers, and they would always lose. They just couldn't unionize because the big factory farms and the big and plant based farms too. It was just large industrial agricultural operations would always find ingenious ways to crush them. On one site, they'd hire just local toughs to beat people up because they knew the sheriff wouldn't arrest anyone anyways because the sheriff was in their pocket. Another site, they'd know that there's a local grocery store that all the workers went to, and they just bribe the local grocery store and say like, don't sell any food to any farm workers who are involved in this. So they were always finding ways to crush the national unions, and the national unions couldn't adapt quickly enough because there were always new challenges. Like the local companies always figure out some way to crush the efforts to unionize. And then suddenly Cesar Chavez comes forward and succeeds at getting almost every single farm in Central California to start unionizing and convincing these huge industries like the grape industry, like these big, powerful industries, to agree to unionize. And the way he did it was by cultivating strategic capacity. And a huge part of this was just going into these communities instead of saying like, here's our plan, go execute it. They just say like, hey, you guys should just do what you want to do. And we're going to give you not just control, but actual, like the United Farm Workers was like this really democratic organization where the local organizers would have enormous influence and oftentimes just, as you said, just activated completely autonomously. So in the example Marshall Gantz writes about in this book called How David Sometimes Win, I think that's the name of the book. I think it's called How David Sometimes Wins, is there was a farm site where they were trying to organize. And one of the things, the United Farm Workers found was effective was just like, hey, find out when the workers are off their shift and leaving and just stand outside on the road and get their names and contact information and invite them to an event, right? Kind of an obvious thing to do. But there was a farm site where, again, I think because of corruption, basically, or I actually think maybe even a law was passed, an unconstitutional law was passed, essentially, because in the United States, you're actually not supposed to prohibit people from standing on public streets because we have something called free speech in the First Amendment that prohibits governments from doing it. They do it all the time anyways, and it takes a long time to strike these laws down. I know this because we fought ag-gag laws for years, and they still exist. It's kind of ridiculous that ag-gag laws still exist because they're unconstitutional, but they still get passed. But there's a law passed just preventing people from even just canvassing on a public street. And, it would have taken years of litigation to try and fight this. And by then, like the organizers get tired, they didn't have the money, the resources. And so, but what Cesar Chavez did was said like, look, you guys have to figure out yourselves. And all we're doing is providing some inspiration and structure, figure it out yourself. And so what the local group did was they just positioned themselves like a mile away and had these loudspeakers set up to talk to everyone, say, hey, come over here if you are interested in getting involved in a union and like helping improve your lives. And it was like, oh, that's obvious. But there was enough local autonomy that the local groups could kind of adapt to the circumstances and figure out what's the best way to organize our people. And other groups like would innovate and realize like one of the big innovations that I think came from a grassroots group was, hey, we should this is kind of a weird thing, but we should offer people funeral insurance. Because apparently in Mexican culture, like you're having a big expensive funeral is really important to the culture. And in Mexico, there's a lot of these insurance companies that provide that service. But in the United States, given that these are recent immigrants, there just isn't that structure there. And so they basically gathered a bunch of people and said, like, hey, if you join us, you can get this insurance. And all these workers are like, oh yeah, I got to be there. Even if I'm not interested in the union, I kind of have to be a union member because there's this local insurance. I mean, so there's all these like little weird things that local groups did that ended up innovating in a way that led to the United Farm Workers being one of the most powerful social movements in American history, and unionizing when all these big unions like the AFL-CIO, these centralized organizations, just couldn't win. They couldn't win. Now, the problem, though, was with the United Farm Workers. Do you know the story of how it all fell apart?
No.
Yeah. So I think it was, I mean, there's a lot of explanations for why it fell apart. One of them is that apparently Cesar Chavez just kind of went a little crazy. Like he just became really weird and started believing these weird conspiracy theories. But I think the real reason wasn't just one person going a little weird. It's that decentralized groups are extremely, even back then, are extremely hard to sustain over the long term. Because when one key leader goes a little crazy and starts all these fights, and Cesar Chavez like started fights with Marshall Gantz, he started fights with all these people. They're just all these fights. It's very hard to sustain. Like centralized organizations are easier to sustain because it's like clear what the authority structure is. You can retain an office. You know, it's clear. Everything's clear and therefore easier than a decentralized organization like the United Farm Workers. And so the United Farm Workers doesn't exist anymore. And they did a very good job in the 70s, but like farm workers are in a very bad state today. And part of the reason is because the great work they did in decentralized organizing in the 1970s. And I'm sure I'm butchering a lot of the facts. I'm not an expert in the farm workers movement. So if there's someone who's listening to this who is, please correct all the facts that I'm saying that are wrong. But this is roughly accurate. That it was really hard to sustain over the long term. So the thing I'll push back on. So the point I think you made that I agree with 100% is that finding a way to empower local groups is incredibly important. You know, and when we started DXC, this wasn't one of our core values that are public facing, but internally, one of our internal core principles was something called emergent leadership, which is basically the idea that any good leader creates other leaders. That's the goal of leadership. You should just be trying to spread this as much as possible. So the thing I want to disagree on is actually, I kind of already, I didn't disagree as much as I just think there's like a frailty to that model that I think is not, I don't think I understand what's wrong with it. And we tried hard for years to sustain, and direct action ever still exists. You know, it still exists today. It's now 12 years into that project. It's new leadership, which is, you know, in many ways so much better than everything I did. But it's still suffering from that centrifugal force, that thing that just like pulls decentralized organizations apart. The question I have for you that's a little bit of a challenge is I'm not convinced if your goal is to build strategic capacity. I never actually defined what strategic capacity is. Marshall Gantz basically said what good movements do is they build the capacity of all their organizers. That is one of your essential objectives, just building their knowledge base, their skill set, their character. You know, are they learning how to work together with other people? All these things are more important in many ways than whatever your stated goal is public facing. A lot of what you're trying to do is just build the power of the movement through strategic capacity. And that's what the United Farm Workers did well. So my question for you is, even if our goal is to build that capacity in the movement, so you said that the pressure campaign is a way to do this. Why can't the tool and the infrastructure, the template, the scaffolding through which you're building this capacity just be narrative? And what I mean by that is in the early days of DXC, we didn't have any campaign at all. I mean, like we kind of had a Chipotle campaign, but not really. It was just kind of like, we had these monthly days of action that we just said like, hey, anyone could participate. And so for example, 1 month, the theme was just love is action, you know, and the idea behind this is like, if you're vegan, get off your ass. Because if you really love animals, love is not just saying you love someone. Love is action when someone is being threatened. Another theme was just killing is not kindness. You just go out there and just use this theme and do something creative and awesome. And then we make these compilation videos. When people would send their videos in, we just make these compilation videos that showed whatever people did to represent that love is action or killing is not kindness. So why does it have to be a pressure campaign as opposed to just some shared narrative that we're all pushing? And this is like the Lauren Gazzola in my ear speaking, because this is what Lauren believes in now. She thinks, no, the key fight here is not with respect to any particular company or even an institution like the government. the key fight here is the culture. And so when we think about low hanging fruit, 1 month it might be like, do you remember Cecil the Lion?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like 1 month, the key narrative that's like a low hanging fruit is, look, we all are concerned about Cecil the Lion. What about the animals in your own neighborhood that are dying, wild and domesticated? The next month, it might be something related to avian flu. And the low hanging fruit we should be targeting is like cultural low hanging fruit that will expand the reach of the animal rights movement, including the strategic capacity of activists as much as possible. Because when Cecil the Lion is going viral or avian flu is going viral, we are going to get way more activists focused on trying to amplify that narrative culturally. And if you lock yourself to one campaign, you're just going to get trapped by the four corners of this campaign and just be so focused on like who's making staples for HLS and not realizing, look, everyone in the country is talking about Cecil the Lion. This is a cultural moment. We should be talking about how Cecil the Lion is just one out of billions of animals that's being killed. It's not just one lion, right? And so what we should do is like culturally hacking the system to identify those key narratives. And Lauren could explain this much better than I do, because Lauren is actually she's basically an unacknowledged co-founder of Direct Action Ever. Because like basically I talked to her for years after she was incarcerated. Lauren, for those of you who don't know, was part of the SHAC USA campaign. She was incarcerated in, I think, 2006 for 5 years. And I was writing letters with her because I was on a legal support team when she came out. I talked to her a lot about what she thinks she learned from the SHAC campaign. And so she shifted. I think she still very much believes what you believe about strategic capacity, but she thinks the key way to develop that is through culture, not through pressure campaigns. So what do you think?
I think that, as I said earlier, I think people can get very caught up in like, this is the right kind of way to do activism and this is the most important thing. I actually think
it's all good. Yeah.
For it to be a healthy movement, each of us kind of needs to decide for ourselves what we think is the most effective thing. I don't disagree with the idea of narrative at all. I do a lot of work with Layla and Natalie at Animal Think Tank, and I think it's vital. I absolutely agree. We need to be tapping into those things. We had recently an E. coli outbreak in the UK, and it turned out it was because of manure from dairy farms being put onto vegetables, and it's like that's something that we could be tapping into. We had the cow that was run down by the police. Marshall and Millions, the two dogs that were killed. So I absolutely agree. I think and this is the thing with the local groups, and I think again, maybe you're coming at it from almost a slightly kind of hierarchical approach again, which is why did the DXE chapters fold? Rather, and that's not what I'm talking about. The local groups that we used to have, the local group network, it existed from like the 1960s, maybe even before, up until the early 2000s, in 2010 kind of period, when it was deliberately eradicated by our government. And it lasted for that long because every local group, it was just a group of friends. Do you know what I mean? We'd have a meeting and we'd get together, and some areas maybe 50 people, some areas maybe 12 people, 10 or whatever. And we would get together once a month and we'd discuss what we're going to do. And if you fell out with everyone in your group, then you could just either just leave and join another movement or leave completely, or you can go and set up another local group. Or, we set up a regional group once because we didn't really agree with what our local group was doing. And so people can code to those things and they can kind of decide, oh yeah, we'll do some DXE stuff, we'll do some We the Free stuff maybe. But actually, most of our focus is going to be on, we used to hand out the McLibel leaflets, the anti-McDonald's leaflets outside McDonald's like regularly. And that wasn't part of a pressure campaign. That was more kind of so actually I think we need all of it, but for all of these things, for there to be a movement to rally around these kind of cultural opportunities, those moments of the whirlwind or whatever, we need a strong local group network. And to keep that local group network motivated and give them something to do in between Cecil the Lion and whatever else, then we need to give them something to do. And for me, the pressure campaigns is something to do.
Just the way to do it. Yeah, that makes sense.
Empowering, but also you can dismantle industries by doing it while you kind of wait for but 100%, like Greg, Natasha, Heather, those of us in the core of SHAG, no, we weren't ready to respond to Cecil the Lion, but that local group network behind us, 100%, that's their thing. Like, they're not beholden to SHAG. They don't have to do any SHAG demos, or they can just do SHAG demos, or they can do whatever they want. And I think that's the key. I think you keep it there, because if you have local DXE chapters, for example, if those chapters have an issue with leadership, over whatever issue might come up, then they disband, and then you have no local group. If that local group is just a local animal rights group and they fall out with the DXE leadership, or they don't like something that's happening there, then it doesn't matter because they're doing a bunch of other stuff anyway. So I think
Yeah. So
that's
how
the
do you
key.
create these local groups?
What?
How are you going to
Sorry,
create these local groups? Because I don't think they exist anymore, right? So
they don't exist
what's
anymore. And this is literally what my focus is at the minute. I'm working a lot with Layla at
Mhm.
Animal Think Tank on this, and we have a plan that is slowly unfolding. But we're kind of using our local town in the most positive of ways as a petri dish, essentially, and we're kind
Hmm.
of putting into action what I know
You're
to be true.
experimenting on animals, Tom? You're
Only
experimenting?
human animals.
I'm just kidding. That was such a bad joke. Among the many flaws I have as a podcast host is my comedy is the worst comedy in the history of YouTube. So I apologize to all the people on YouTube who are actually funny, because I will tell you a lot of jokes that are not funny.
You unleash my tongue, Jack. But yeah, so bringing all these people together, and it is, you know, I kind of know in my head what is a good idea and what will work with this, and so it's, you know, kind of biting the bullet and just being, let's just put it into practice. So we're doing it with our local group,
Yeah.
we're getting everyone together, and you know, we've only had this group for less than 2 months, and already, like, it's grown. You know, my town isn't a big town, and you know, our
Mhm.
group covers the whole county, but it's, you know, it's a rural county with a small major town, and we don't even have a city in our county.
Mm.
And it, just since we've started, we've had, everyone has had more people coming to their action. So now that everyone's talking together, because, you know, people silo, people do We the
Yeah.
Free, and they think that's what activism is. People do DXE, they think that's what activism is, and it's kind of breaking those silos and helping people to recognize that actually, if you work together with these other groups, it's not like you're losing resources, you're not losing activists even. You're
Mhm.
gaining activists, you're gaining resources, you're gaining exposure. And it means that rather than sometimes you'd have like 3, 4, 5 different animal rights events happening in our small town because no one's talking to each other, now you can kind of spread them out and get 3, 4, 5 times as many people on each action.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it means that now people are talking to each other. We've had an oceanarium in Bournemouth since, well, my whole life.
Mm.
And now suddenly, within a month or so of starting our local group up, people have got together autonomously and decided, oh, actually, I can design stickers, I can make leaflets,
Mm.
I can sneak in and film the conditions, I can contact the council, and people are getting together. Now there is a pressure campaign against our local oceanarium that's just
Great.
started because we have this support group around it. And so yeah, so for me, the first thing in rebuilding these local group networks is to recognize that we still have a strong and thriving animal liberation movement. We really do. And a lot of people in that movement want to be focused on grassroots activism and you know, the broader picture. And so it's just getting them in the room to talk to each other. So it's giving, you
Yeah.
know, in each area, it's giving each of those groups and individuals, because, you know, not everyone's affiliated to a group. It's giving those individuals the kind of the buy-in to, you know, explain to them that this benefits you. Like,
Yeah.
we'll all
Yeah.
do better if we all work together. And yeah, in our town, everything we're doing so far is working really well. I'm going to touch
Yeah.
wood because who knows, but maybe we'll have 10 hunt saboteur groups next week. But it's all going very well, and the plan is to kind of roll it out, and then firstly to areas where there already is a, you know, like a reasonably dynamic community that just maybe needs some help or tools or trainings
Mhm.
or whatever, and then into areas where there is less and less,
Yeah.
until hopefully once again every town and city has something. And the idea is that once these groups are set up, because they are, you know, dysfunctional families in a way, if people do start to fall out, they can, you know, they will have the tools to do this, because it will encourage that autonomy to organize your own
Mhm.
actions, your own events, your own meetings. Or, you know, people can face to face at their meetings deal with their issues and agree to disagree when we do. Because something I've
Yeah.
always been really keen on, you know, you know, my big thing is pressure campaigning. That's strategically where my interest lies, direct action and pressure campaigning. But
Mhm.
that's not the only form of activism. And I've always been so keen to say, like, I do not have all the answers on what will work and what won't work. I can tell you what could be effective for sure, but I can't tell you that that's the best way of doing it. Because none of us know. Like, none of us, however like high and mighty and on our pedestals we get, none of us know what's going to work. And the history of social movements, and, you know, my
Other than
personal,
Earthling Ed knows.
he knows a
I'm
lot
just
of
kidding.
things.
I'm just kidding.
But right,
I love Earthling Ed, and he does look like Jesus,
he has
but he's
beautiful
not
hair.
actually Jesus. As far as I know, I don't think he's Jesus. Can't say
Who
for
knows?
sure.
Who
Who
knows?
knows? He could be Jesus, in which case he might know. He might be the one
No,
person
people
who
didn't believe
actually
Jesus
knows.
was Jesus.
That's true.
But
I'm
my
just sorry I
personal
keep
experience
interrupting
is
you with terrible jokes.
It's worth to get a name drop of the wonderful work being in.
Yeah.
But yeah, my history has shown me that I've done actions that I thought, this action is like amazing and everything's going to change after today. And then I do it and nothing happens. And then I've done
Yeah.
actions that I'm like, oh, I don't really know what to do. I'll just do this today. And then it has this huge effect.
Turns
So
out,
even just
yeah.
on, my personal little microcosm of activism, like you don't know what's effective.
What's
And,
gonna
and
work?
certainly when
Yeah.
you get into strategy, you can research other social movements, but you don't know what's going to be effective. And I think even in research, and this is something you're going to enjoy coming back at me on, but even in the history of social movements, firstly, a lot of our history is quite tainted, I think. I think we tend to look at Gandhi, but we don't look at the assassinations of British soldiers. We look at
Mhm.
Martin Luther King, but we don't look at Malcolm X and the Black Panthers. I think, we
Or you could just
tend
look
to
at Nelson
completely
Mandela. We
ignore.
look at Nelson Mandela after 1995 and not before 1995, or
Right.
like whatever the exact year was.
And the IRA just
Nelson
don't get a
Mandela is like,
mention.
yeah, no,
Anetta
that is a
and
weird example. So, but yeah, I mean, we could
but,
argue about that a lot, but I think you're making a very good point that
but
history of
the
the
other
social movements is very colored for sure.
the
It's very
other
colored by the filter of,
it
yeah.
is. And also I think something else that we often miss when we look at other social movements is the fact that our movement is probably the only social movement in history that is comprised entirely of allies.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say that other animals don't have their own agency, but generally when they express that agency, when they escape from farms or sink a boat or whatever, we tend to, as a species, then kind of make sure that doesn't happen again.
Mm-hmm.
So we consistently remove their agency, and within our movement, we have no non-human animals having a voice in it, which is
Yeah.
obvious, but also I don't think there's ever been a
It's an
social
important
movement in
difference.
history that is entirely allies. So I think that's a huge
Huge difference. Yeah.
thing for us to have to bridge and to understand. And you could look at the movements, but we don't have that. And that's why for me, and this is a little bit speciesist. It's weird no one's ever called me speciesist to my face, because I
I
probably am.
called you speciesist earlier, didn't I?
You should have
I don't
if you
even remember
didn't.
why. What did you say? I
No,
think
you
you
called
said something.
yourself speciesist.
Oh no, I
But
called myself speciesist. What did I say? I
we
said,
all,
I don't even remember. All right, forget it. Let's move
but
on. Let's
I
cut
think
this from the podcast.
neither of us are speciesist. But
Neither of us is speciesist.
if we want to help pull people out of this mass global atrocity that, as we described, is worse than anything that's ever happened, if we want to help pull people out of that, it's hard to do that in one go,
Mm-hmm.
because there's so much to acknowledge about yourself and everyone you love and everyone you care about.
Yeah.
So the best way of doing that is just to kind of just tug enough so you can notice something isn't right, and then something
Mm-hmm.
else, and then something else, and suddenly
Mm.
it all starts swamping you. And for me, if we look at history, social history, if we look at the Right to Marry campaign, the reason that was so effective is because they were able to relate it to people, to someone who is gay or queer,
Yeah.
like, or whether it's personally, whether it's through TV or movies or music, like someone you care about somewhere along the line either
Mm-hmm.
is or is related to or is close to someone that is gay or queer. Therefore, you should relate to this campaign. And obviously there's a lot more to it than that, but that is the buy-in for people. It's like, oh yeah, no, actually, like, yeah, they are people too. I do know these people. And so for me, if I want to hook people into the animal liberation movement and start considering veganism and the much wider issues of liberation, the easiest way for me to do that is dogs. Like, most people know a dog or know of a dog.
For sure.
And most of us have positive experiences around dogs. Not everyone, but most people have positive experiences around dogs. And so to go at animal testing from the dog's perspective,
Mm-hmm.
like, to me, it's wild to me that they haven't got rid of dog testing, because it's such an obvious gateway into our movement. And then greyhound racing, hare coursing, anything to do with dogs, you're going to get support.
Yeah.
And then once people start thinking about dogs in laboratories, they'll start thinking about monkeys in laboratories. They'll start thinking about rabbits, and rats, and mice, and cats, and horses, and deer. And once they start thinking about pigs and sheep in those places, then they start thinking about it on their plate, and then you're bringing people out of it. So yeah, that was off topic, but that was important, I think.
Yeah, it is important. Yeah, I mean, I think the work you're doing in terms of this local organizing stuff, it's beautiful, and I'm really glad you're doing it. I didn't even realize you were working with Layla and the Animal Think Tank. I don't know Layla as well as I know Mark, but I'm probably gonna have Mark on the show at some point, and I'm sure this is actually useful fodder for our conversation later. Um, all right, so we've been going quite a long time, and I haven't actually even asked you about yourself. So I think I owe it to the audience to at least
You
ask
threatened to a few
two
times.
questions. I kept threatening to move in that direction, and I kept failing to fulfill the threat. No, it's not a threat; it's an opportunity. Um, so how did you get involved now? I mean, the two big questions I'm going to ask you are just how did you get involved yourself initially, and then tell us how you ended up in jail. Or actually, is there a distinction between jail and prison in the UK? Is that a
No,
thing? It's
no,
all the
there
same.
isn't. No, basically, I mean, there
Okay.
probably is, but like, no, it's not the same as in
No one
America.
talks
Like,
about it. Okay.
you get arrested and you go to a police station and you go to jail/prison, which is
And
a
it's all the
big,
same. Interesting. Okay.
big
So,
bad
but
place.
just why don't you, can you just tell us, because I don't even know the answer to this. I think I may have read it at some point, but how did you get involved in activism in the first place?
It all started when I was 9. Obviously, I didn't become an activist at 9, but I maybe I did. I used to go. There's a butcher shop near where I lived, like in the New Forest, a lovely part of England. There was a butcher shop there. My dad used to take me there fairly regularly to collect his meat, and or I guess for our family, like our family dinner. And outside there was a petting zoo, which
Oh, I
is
do remember hearing the story. Sorry.
weird. Yeah, I thought I told you last time we
Yeah.
spoke, but in this petting zoo, there's these two pigs, and to me, they were my friends. I would look
Mhm.
forward to going to this place because I would get to play with these pigs. I think one of them was called Violet. I can't remember the other.
Mhm.
And then one Christmas, my dad kind of beckoned me into the shop. He was like, they got mince pies inside. They're giving out free food. Come in. And I ran into this shop, and I just kind of stopped dead in the door because I remember being braces of pheasants hanging up and rabbits hanging
Mhm.
up, but and just these plates of meat like with blood around them, and that everyone had told me was juice, but was quite clearly blood. But then the thing
Wow.
that really stuck in my head was just these skinned pigs hanging from the wall.
Mm.
And as I went to this place as a 9-year-old child regularly to go and play with my friends outside who were pigs. And
Mhm.
now I find out inside this building
Mm.
are skinned dead pigs. They're friends, their families,
Mhm.
they're whatever. And it it was just horrifying. And beyond that, this was what was being fed to me. Like I was expected to eat my friends. Like
Wow.
I think in that moment, something in me broke a little bit, and I went home almost certainly in silence. And when I got home, I declared to my parents I was vegetarian, and then
Yeah.
which luckily they supported. But I think then when I
Did
was
they actually kill Violet? Was Violet killed?
no, so the two in the petting zoo were potbelly pigs, so
I
we don't
see.
eat
So
them
they
here.
weren't the farm pigs. Yeah.
Yeah, so that, but even so, like they were a pig. Like I don't think
Mhm.
as a child I particularly cared what species of, or which
Which
breed of
breed?
pig they
Yeah.
were. Um,
And
so
pot-bellied pigs, for those people who don't know, are just like they're smaller pigs, although they still get pretty big. I mean, you can have like a 300-pound potbelly.
yeah,
Like compared to farm pigs, I mean, farm pigs are huge, like 600, 700 pounds at adulthood. And so they had these two cute little pigs outside. That's just such a bizarre. I mean, did they think that was a marketing tool? Like, what was the
they
point of
still have it. The petting zoo is still
really?
there. It's
Oh my
yeah,
God, it's so
but I
weird.
think they're trying to make it like a fun family thing where you can go because it was a butcher slop slash farm shop slash abattoir
Wow.
slash farm, and then they have this petting zoo. So I think they want to get people in to then buy dead animals.
Yeah, the cognitive
It's a
dissonance
bizarre
there. That's
thing.
so weird.
So perverse. It's so
Yeah.
perverse. It baffles me. But I mean, it did a good job on me, I suppose,
Yeah.
in radicalizing me as a child. And yeah, so I think then I was probably 30. I think from that point, it wasn't just that I went vegetarian. I think I stopped trusting people. I
Mm,
stopped, or at least blindly trusting authority. I stopped.
yeah.
If my parents told me something, I didn't just accept it was true.
Except, yeah.
And the same with like teachers and stuff, because everyone had lied to me, and it was
Wow.
quite overt and violent a lie. And so then I was 13 and I first heard punk music. My brother got me into punk music. And I think, as soon as I heard it, it was like this. I mean,
Mm.
firstly, I think punk is the soundtrack to ADHD, which kind of fits quite nicely with me. But also, like lyrically, it was like, yeah, like these people are
Yeah.
saying what I'm thinking, and they're
Wow.
not telling me to believe what they're saying. They're telling me to question authority, to
Yeah.
make positive change. Like this is a positive thing. 15, I became straight edge because I read an article about how the straight edge kids in America were,
Mhm.
the ALF actions, the ALF act, what became the Green Scare actions, the
Mhm.
big kind of 90s ALF, ELF arsons and liberations. and the kind of connection to the straight edge scene, which, you know, I hadn't really heard of either of those things before. But as soon as, you know, I was reading about people breaking into laboratories and rescuing hundreds of animals, I was like, I don't know who these people are. I'm 15. I live in a small town in the UK. These people are the other side of the world. I don't, you know, we didn't have the internet particularly back then, and I'm never going to meet these people, but whoever they are, that's my people.
My
Like
people.
those,
Wow.
like, so literally, you know, everyone in the UK, everyone's an alcoholic pretty much. And I
Yeah.
was 15 and I was like, I'm done. It's kind of fun and rebellious when I was 13, 14, but I have things to do now, and I can be a better version of me, and I can, you know, devote myself to something more positive. And I think me and my brother, we kind of created a version of straight edge that was slightly different from what, you know, the scenes in America. We for us, it was all about dumpster diving and jumping trains and direct action and all those kind of, you know, squatting and just kind of almost a romantic version of it, which is, you know, really how we started to live. And it was, you know, it was exciting and it was fun. And you know, we would go out and do actions. And, you know, I wasn't even vegan at this point, but me and my brother at 15 went to try and raid our local mink farm.
Wow. At 15.
It went as well as you'd probably expect. I think we were sat in a tree. I remember really clearly. Me and my brother sat next to each other in this tree, and we had full nuclear fallout suits on, like camouflage nuclear fallout suits. We had 3-hole balaclavas on. We're sat in this tree with binoculars watching this farm. And to this day, I didn't actually even know if we were looking at the farm or just some random building. I think we were looking at the farm. And then it occurred to me, we've been up there.
It turns out it's like a Walgreens or something. It's like, oh wait, this is a drugstore. You break in there like, free the mink, and it's like, oh wait, there's just Band-Aids and chips here.
But there was people, like there was horse riders about, and there was hikers, and there was all these people just wandering about. And we were up there for about 15, 20 minutes. And I turned to my brother and said, it's the middle of winter. Like we're in a tree that has no foliage. And yet we're camouflaged and balaclavaed, but I think that's making us stand out more. And we realized all these horse riders were looking at us like, what are those?
Like, what are you doing up there?
So we gave up on that plan, and we went.
If only the open rescue experience existed back then. I would teach you about threat points, because this is what we do in our training. Teach you about threat points and how to surveil threat points before you come to the site. But anyways,
I think we were the threat point, but we went to our local fishing lake instead, and we found a D-lock somewhere and D-locked up our local fishing lake with all the fishermen inside. So that was something. And then we'd do fly posting and stuff, other stuff. So we kind of radicalized ourselves through reading the ALF support group newsletters and things like that.
Music was a big part of it too, right? Just the music itself. It wasn't just the culture and the philosophy of the straight edge scene. It was the music that really inspired a lot of people.
I'm going to be honest. I've never been huge on the straight edge music. I think lyrically, I love Earth Crisis lyrically.
Okay.
Audibly, not so much. I kind of, I'm kind of, although I am a fairly crusty punk in many ways, like most of the music I listen to from that kind of genre and what kind of fires me is kind of 90s street punk, like kind of something with a little bit catchy. Do you know what I mean? Something I can dance away to. Not that I can dance, it's moshing, but yeah, I'm not fighting.
So not Taylor Swift and Dua Lipa.
But yeah,
no offense to anyone who likes Taylor Swift and Dua Lipa, for the record, because I actually kind of like Dua Lipa. But anyways, it's catchy. Dua Lipa's not bad.
I wouldn't know, but I have many. I'm not even going to call them guilty pleasures. I have many pop acts that I love. So
good.
I'm not
judge.
But we did have things like Crass and Conflict, and the kind of like the anarcho punk scene, and that I could listen to more than I could listen to the hardcore stuff. So yeah, I didn't really listen to straight edge music, but the vegan, the anarchist music, that definitely was a big part of me. And so then shortly,
it's all gone now.
It is. I mean, it's not all gone, but it's mostly gone. I think.
But there's no new stuff. There's no music in any genre.
I think like drill music still. I'm sure there's probably some drill fans out there that would say they have a thriving community, but
I literally have no idea what the hell you were just saying. Like that word drill. I think you were talking about tools and fixing things, but I'm not sure.
It's a horrifically violent offshoot of grime music, but
I also don't know what that is.
British hip hop. But it comes from a very similar place, I think, to where punk music came from, and I find it intriguing. It's very different lyrically, but in terms of the kind of communities it's coming from, and I'm fascinated, and the fact that police are trying to ban it, I
Yeah.
find interesting.
I think the UK might be different, but in the United States, I feel like the music scene, like the independent music scene, has died. It's all just monocrop. It's all Taylor
And
Swift and Dua Lipa. Even like cool people, they like talking about how they like Beyonce instead of Taylor Swift. Like that's indie in the United States.
I think it's an
I'm so
inevitability.
indie. I listen to Beyonce, not Taylor Swift.
It's an inevitability because when I was growing, when I was a 15-year-old listening to punk music, I would have to go to a punk gig, and probably cycle like 20 miles to like some punk gig, and then pick up a fanzine, and then it would have the review section, and it would say, oh, this sounds a bit like Early Rancid, and I'd be like, okay, I quite like Early Rancid. I'll send off a check to America and see what I get, and then
Wow.
2 weeks later or more, like I'd get
Yeah.
a cassette through the post, and then either it would go in the trash
God.
pile, or I'd then copy
Yeah.
it from. It was
Yeah.
effort. I mean, it was effort to find
Yeah.
music, and therefore you had. That's why we kind of had that tribalism, because
Yeah.
you wouldn't do that for like 4 different genres of music. You would do that for your
Yeah.
genre of music. Whereas now you just go on Spotify and be like, oh, Spotify, pay
Yeah.
me something, and you'll find all
Mm-hmm.
kinds of music. So it's not surprising. And I think youth culture now is based around identity politics rather than music. And I think that's fine. I just think as old people, we just need to accept that.
It's not fine. It's
Happens.
terrible.
It'll
But
come back. Everything goes
that's a
away.
subject for another conversation. I won't say it's completely terrible. I think there are some good things about identity politics, but interesting. Okay, so last question, and then I'll
I
just.
didn't get to how I got into animal rights.
That's right, you
Really.
didn't. Okay, so
Well,
finish that
I
thought, and
kind
then
of
I have
did, but
one
like
other big question.
into the movement. That was me and my brother doing stuff. But I was 16. I contacted one of the local hunt sabs. The short version of the story, he invited me out sabbing. I'm going to tell the long version. I went to my local police station because, someone, I don't know how old he was, probably late 20s, early 30s. He'd invited me out hunt sabbing. I was like 16. I was like, I don't know what this is. It sounds fun. So I went to the police station because I grew up in this little town. So I was there with my mohawk and my bondage trousers and
Nice.
everything. I went in and I was like, can you tell me about hunt sabbing? And the guy behind because that's what we did. You asked, we had we trusted our local cop. I mean, they're ACAB, like for sure. But like at the time, like that was the town I grew up in. And he told me all about hunt sabbing and what it was and how it worked. And I was like, okay, should I go? And he was like, no. It was like, it can get violent, like you could get arrested. And I was like, okay.
And you're like, all right, I'm into that.
But kind of, I think it's probably, I'd like to say, that's the version I tell people. It's probably more the fact I'm kind of a people pleaser. And I'd already kind of had this conversation about going sabbing, and I didn't want to let him down. So and the cop didn't put me off. I'm going to say the cop didn't put me off. And so I got on the bus and went and told my mum I was going to sleep at a friend's house and going to a party. And I stayed at this guy's house overnight with his partner, and just learned so much about the history of the animal liberation movement, about the punk scene, and it was just amazing. And then in the morning, like someone pulled up in a Land Rover, and there's like 6 people in like masks in the back of this van, and the stinks of citronella that they use to mask the scent of the foxes. And again, like I was like, this is amazing. Like whatever's happening this. And then we went out I remember the huntsman tried to ride down one of the women we were with. He literally tried to like trample her with his horse, and I was like, "What happened?" I'm 16, like I've never been sabbing. I was like, "What?" And I turned around and like everyone's just pulling her down. We used to wear balaclavas. We used to roll them up as like hats. I didn't realize this, but then everyone just started rolling down these balaclavas. I was like, "Oh shit!" And then the huntsman
that's good and serious now.
And his white riding trousers turned a shade of brown, and he vanished very quickly into the sunset. And again, it was just so empowering. You have these really rich landowners, the 1% of Britain, and they're terrified of us. I mean, we're not violent people. No one's actually going to. Well, maybe I don't know, but we're we're nice people. We're motivated by love, and they're terrified of us. And for me, that was so empowering. And then I kind of kept doing activism for another 2 years. I was 18 when I went vegan, so I was actually an activist for 2 years before I became vegan, which to me is a good argument for creating activists rather than vegans, because
hell yes. Hell yes.
Yeah. So and then eventually I wanted to be vegan. I was in the back of the Sab vans having these conversations. I was going to big protests, anti-vivisection protests, McDonald's protests. I wanted to be vegan, but my mum and dad did all my shopping and my cooking, and I felt that I didn't have agency in it, which I definitely did, and I chose not to. But eventually I was having a conversation with my friend's daughter. She was 6 at the time, outside of a company that was involved in animal testing, and she was asking why I was wearing leather boots, and I was like, I kind of shoplifted them, but yeah, I guess it's not okay. And she was, we had this whole discussion about why I wasn't vegan, and I was like, at some point, quite early in this conversation, I was like, if I'm losing an argument with a 6-year-old, I'm clearly wrong. So that was kind of a defining moment, and I became vegan at 18, and then got involved more and more in SHAC and local activism.
Yeah, that's actually one of the primary reasons I got really involved in animal rights, or at least in my own personal story. I don't know if it actually is the reason, because I think we're not the best about diagnosing the causes of our own behavior and our own changes in our personal lives. This is just another social scientific finding that, for example, people always underappreciate the effect of social influence on their own behaviors. They always think they're very independent minded, including punks. Even punks, you're just affected by a different group of individuals, just maybe not the mainstream, just different individuals. But in my own story about how I changed, one of the reasons I changed is because when I read Animal Liberation when I was like 16 years old, I tried to argue against animal rights and realized it was extremely difficult. That it's just intellectually, in terms of the coherence and consistency of the positions you take when you're an animal rights activist, you're just on much better ground. So you can be a 6-year-old debating a distinguished philosopher, and you will win the argument for animal rights. So a lot of stuff that's really interesting that'd be great to unpack. But given that we're almost 2 hours in, my last question before I just ask you to share with the audience where they can find you and your book and stuff is, you spent some time in jail. Can you just explain what happened and what you learned from that experience, if anything? Or maybe you didn't learn anything, it was just awful, but tell us how you ended up in jail.
Unfortunately, this is quite a convoluted story, and this is literally why I wrote a book covering the history of the SHAC campaign.
So give us the short version, and then we'll direct people to your book.
I would do my best. So essentially, you asked earlier why the government clapped down on us so hard here, and why they bailed out Huntington so much. And the main reason was a guy called David Sainsbury, who was born a millionaire. He invested in biotechnology, which was mostly animal testing and GM research at the time, and became a billionaire. He gave a huge donation to Tony Blair as soon as he was elected to power in 1997, and essentially he bought the position of science minister, which is normally something that you have to be voted into parliament, but he kind of bypassed that through the House of Lords by giving this massive donation. So this biotech billionaire who had huge investments in animal testing had bought the most powerful position in the country for science. And he was personally responsible for Huntington being bailed out by the government for their banking and for their insurance. He was responsible for getting home demonstrations banned. He was responsible for getting office occupations banned. He was responsible for this law that made it a crime to interfere with the contractual relationships of an animal research organization, which is a stupid law. So he was, we were his enemy. And for him, he wanted to increase his profits. I think Lobby Watch estimate that he increased the profits of his companies by 300% just by the decisions he made as science minister. And obviously he wanted to get rid of us, in his words, eradicate us. And so that's what they set out to do. So SHAC was a lawful campaign, and the most of what we were doing was researching and identifying companies connected to Huntington Life Sciences and releasing their publicly available corporate information, their office locations, their phone numbers, their email addresses, their corporate structure, releasing that for the local groups to kind of do what they wanted with. And, if they chose to be lawful, which we had, by the end of the campaign, we had like heavy disclaimers on everything, like do not use this for anything criminal. And if people listened to those disclaimers, then the actions were SHAC actions. If they chose to ignore them, then they were Animal Liberation Front, Militant Forces Against HLS, whatever they chose to call themselves. So we were a lawful campaign, and they wanted it stopped. So what they did, it started in America with the SHAC USA. If people haven't watched Animal People, that gives a version of what happened to SHAC USA. Then it went to Canada. They got rid of SHAC Canada. Then it came across the UK and finally ended up with SHAC. And they did a few things, but the main thing was there was a guy called Adrian Radford who was, for want of a better word, he was a professional informant. He infiltrated SHAC because the City of London had offered a £25 million reward for the conviction of animal rights extremists. Which, you know, I understand why that's tempted. Like, we were tempted to hand ourselves in, to be honest. We were planning how we could claim some of that money by serving a few years in prison. But he was clearly lured by that money. He quit his job. He was a private investigator investigating SHAC, but he quit that job to infiltrate SHAC. He turned up at one of our animal rights gatherings, and he was so flamboyant and camp and so far removed from every undercover cop we'd ever outed from the campaign that he was too visible, I think, for a lot of people to be dodgy. And he managed to infiltrate the campaign very. I mean, I despise him probably more than I despise many other people in the planet, but he was very good at his job, and he infiltrated us. But infiltrating SHAC was as easy as saying, "Hi, can I help?" Because we were a lawful organization. He helped the news area, he helped the website. And he then set up, because he had obviously promised the police he was infiltrating the ALF rather than SHAC. So he then set up his own ALF cell with 2 new activists and raided a chicken farm. And then he ended up, in one night, I think he wrote off 13 vehicles belonging to people connected to the import of laboratory animals. And so, which is more than any ALF activist was convicted of during the whole course of the campaign, the 14 years of the campaign. So he was doing significant direct action and organizing it and funding it and everything.
So wait, can you explain, what did he do to 14 people?
So he basically poured paint stripper on their cars outside their houses.
I see.
And wrote them off so that they couldn't use it. They'd have to get their scrapped because they were valueless. And but that was more than any ALF activist was ever convicted of. And that was just in one night. And he was obviously active for a long time. And then
was that an action that was encouraged by the police, that they told him to do?
According to him, he's given an interview since, and he said that the police picked his target.
Told him to do that.
It was, one of them was the owner of Heathrow Airport, and he said that his words were, the police chose that target to make it political, because when it gets political, people start to get rounded up.
Attention.
That's a direct quote from him. And so he then made a phone call to one of the suppliers of Hunting Life Sciences that was fairly blackmaily in nature. It was basically, if you in British law, blackmail has nothing to do with money. It's making an unwarranted demand with a menace. So he phoned up this company and basically said, stop dealing with this laboratory as the unwarranted demand, or else you'll go on our website and people might do bad things as the menace. And that was the only example given in court of anyone making, or certainly in the prosecution statement, of anyone making a blackmail threat. But it was enough to get my friends and I think there was 32 of us initially arrested in 3 countries, UK, Belgium, Netherlands. We had our doors kicked in by 700 police officers in total, dragged out of bed all at the same time, like early in the morning. And Greg, Natasha, Heather were remanded straight to prison. Several of my friends were charged with this blackmail. Nicola, my partner, and I, we weren't charged with blackmail, but we were left on like police bail while they investigated. And so we kind of took a step back and were like, what do? We visited Greg in prison. And he was like, just stop. Like, this is getting serious. Just stop. Like, someone else will pick it up. And there was other people that had basically promised, we're ready to help. And so we took a step back and we're like, okay, other people are going to help. And then nothing happened. And I later found out in Europe there'd been these kind of secret meetings amongst various national structures in Europe where they decided that they were just going to stop completely, but didn't tell us. And then in the UK, I think a lot of people were just too scared because of the repression. And so, a few days passed, a week passed, and we were like, we can't let this die. Like, at this point, this was 2007. So, we're 7-8 years into this campaign. Like, we've given everything. Like, this has happened because Hunting Life Sciences were on the verge of bankruptcy. And they were. We were destroying them financially. And we can't just let that be for nothing. I can't let 7-8 years of my life be for nothing. And also, I had friends. There was like, one of my friends was serving a life license for an arson attack connected to it. And, you had people like Daniel San Diego Andreas in America, who was, he's still on the run now for an action against Hunting Life Sciences. And it's like, how can I look myself in the mirror knowing that these people have sacrificed everything, and I'm just going to turn my back on that because things are getting a bit hot and I'm under surveillance or whatever. So me and Nicola and this very small group of friends, we got together and we're like, we have to keep this going. It's funny. It's always been reported since that SHAC had this contingency plan, like we had people ready. It's we absolutely didn't. The police
Wow.
knew that any contingency that might have existed, those people were charged. Like we were doing, we were trying to close down a military research facility, which we did at the same time as this, but we were focused on other stuff. We were helping with SHAC. We were like certainly behind the scenes in a way the police clearly didn't understand, but we weren't the contingency. We just couldn't let this between us. We just couldn't let this die. Like it was too personal, and we were so close. Everything everyone had sacrificed, I wasn't going to throw that away. And yeah, so we started coordinating SHAC. We tried to decentralize it a little bit more. We kind of spread the roles out around the country a little bit more, and we just focused on keeping it going. And so that was 2007, and the campaign officially ended 7 years later. So actually, those raids were only halfway through the campaign. And it continued to be incredibly effective. Like the amount of action stopped pretty much the entire, not that there are still people that are still active now that were active then, but most of that kind of generation of activists kind of left. And we had this whole new wave that came in that were just affronted by the oppression, which is quite beautiful and remarkable and inspire. Obviously we inspired them and they inspired us. And there was a former police officer who was like a specialist animal rights officer. He wrote a report afterwards, and he said that after those raids, after Greg, Natasha, Heather were sent to prison, the number of actions decreased, but the severity increased. And there was, yes, particularly across mainland Europe, that's when the militant forces against hunting life sciences kind of were created. Because I think it's that thing, that if you make peaceful protest impossible, you make violent revolution inevitable. And I think that's a big part of it, because in the UK we were facing 5 years in prison for handing out a leaflet. Like literally we had this SOCPA law, this law that made it a crime to interfere with the relationships of these businesses, and that could be just stepping onto a car park to get someone a leaflet, could be a 5-year prison sentence. All these companies had injunctions banning us from using megaphones, wearing costumes, having more than 6 people on a protest, protesting more than once a fortnight. So we were so repressed in what we could do. And then you just had this huge upsurge of stuff. And, to put it into context, and again, this wasn't SHAC, this was the militant forces, whoever that was. And the CEO of Novartis, the guy called Daniel Vasella, is one of the richest men in the world. He was on the steering committee of the Bilderberg Group, if that means anything to anyone. And he was one of the most powerful people in the world. And he had a hunting lodge up in the Austrian Alps that got burnt down. Novartis had a sports complex on the Franco-Swiss border that got burnt down. It was a really intense period of activism, just arson attacks almost like weekly, if not nightly, across Europe.
Wow.
Yeah, and so it was an intense time, but the SHAC campaign itself became even more lawful than it had been. We were taking every precaution. Every protest was arranged with the police. Everything had disclaimers. Everything was checked by barristers. And still they just kept coming for us, because it wasn't about preventing crime, it was about shutting us up. Sure. And it became, more and more clear. My friend Jera was convicted for this, and in her license conditions when she was released, one of her conditions, I can't remember what it was, it's something maybe about talking about animal testing, but it said the reason for this license, because they have to say why you're getting these conditions when you're released from prison, and it was to frustrate political activity, was literally what it said. They gave us ASBOs that, Greg, Natasha, Heather, they're still restricted on even being able to talk about animal testing publicly. So this was about shutting us up. And so they kept coming. So in 2 years, the 2 years after our first arrest, we were raided another 3 times. And then, trying to be sneaky, like cutting through glass doors and coming at different times of day to see if our computers might be unencrypted. And one of my friends, who later turned out he became a police informant, but the police dressed as couriers and knocked on his door in like a Royal Mail uniform with a fake box. And he answered the door and they were like, "Are you Chris Potter?" And he was like, "Yeah." And they just like dropped the box and like twisted him up and arrested him. And then this rental van, like all these armed police jump out the back and run in and arrest his girlfriend. So they were getting sneakier and sneakier, but it was all fairly...
You said this guy became a police informant, Chris Potter?
Yeah.
Wow, that's messed up.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Me too. He got me an extra year in prison, which was nice. Not even for anything I did, for things he did. He just blamed them on me. Yeah.
What happened to this guy? Is this guy still around? I assume he's disappeared from the movement.
Yeah, I tried to interview him for my book, and he agreed and then vanished.
Wow.
Which probably isn't surprising.
I'm just shocked he even agreed.
Yeah, I think he probably panicked. He wasn't expecting me to reach out to him, to be
So,
honest. But I wanted it to be a full
dang.
account, and I'd like to hear his story. But yeah, that was fun. We had actually two police informants living in our house at various times. Here's one of them. We had another one as well.
So people like Adrian, I mean, obviously you can understand more because this guy was like
Right, it's for money.
informant from
Yeah.
day one. What do you think caused Chris to turn?
I don't know. I mean, he was young. He was like 16 when he got involved. He was a punk, and then it all got quite serious. There's a few actions that he got arrested rescuing a chicken from an abattoir once,
Hmm.
and they got away. And then I think he was arrested, and then nothing came of it, and it was a bit suspicious. I wonder if that was
Why? Yeah. So
his
they put
parents
pressure on
worked
him.
for security services, so I wonder if pressure was put on them. Yeah.
Dang.
So yeah, who knows? But yeah,
So this
that.
is the value of open organizing, my friend.
Well, I wasn't even
This
organizing. He
is,
was just doing shit himself and then blaming it
but
on me.
I'm just saying, like, this is one of the reasons I believe so much in open rescue and open organizing because we've had attempts at infiltration a lot, and it just doesn't work when we're open about everything. It's
The
just like,
problem we had was the people doing the criminal stuff, the
yeah,
ALF, the militant forces, they weren't
hmm
getting caught
caught, yeah. So they're
because
blaming the
they were working
people.
in close affinity groups.
Yeah,
We were doing lawful activism,
yeah,
but then if you have someone that does an action and blames it on you or
yeah,
plants evidence on you,
yeah. Then you're screwed.
what do you do, whether you're open or not? And that's for me a problem with open organizing is you're opening up a lot of potentially you're opening a lot of people. If the police decide to play dirty and plant evidence on someone, you suddenly have a massive conspiracy, and they know
Yeah,
everyone they can drag into the conspiracy. So that's what happened with us. We all got dragged in this conspiracy that we didn't have a part in,
yeah.
and that I
But
don't really.
there's no underground activism as part of the campaign at all. And I'm not saying there shouldn't be underground activism. And I think we could have debates about that. But if it's completely separate from the open organizing, the only person who's been charged of conspiracy in DXC history is me. And it
That's a
didn't
small
take
conspiracy.
it wasn't the greatest police investigation in history to figure out I was the one organizing this stuff. Like, I talked about it very openly. I called the police myself and told them what I was doing. I said, I'm organizing a big demonstration at a factory farm. We're going to walk in and take all the animals out because we think they're being mistreated. It didn't take the greatest detective in history to figure out I was the organizer, right? And so even when they do bring down the hammer, like in the Smithfield case, where they did have like dozens of FBI agents and they surveilled my phones and all this stuff, the entire nation, including other law enforcement officers, mocked them because it was so stupid what they were doing. It's like, you think you're the greatest FBI agent in history? Do you realize these people published a VR video of exactly what they did on YouTube like 3 months before you even figured it out? Like, so just, and I think that's an important point. It's the open organizing doesn't just prevent infiltration. It allows you to mock the people who are surveilling you and using all these underhanded tactics in a
Oh, we
way
did.
that you cannot do.
We
Well,
did.
you can do it. That's true. You can do it even with underground action, but it's harder to
But
because the
SHAC
people.
wasn't underground organizing. This is the thing.
Yeah.
And there was obviously, it made it very easy for the police and the state to come down on us because they were able to
Yeah.
conflate us with the Animal Liberation Front.
Yeah.
But they would have done it whatever. They would have found a way. And the fact is, Adrian Radford was committing criminal actions. Chris Potter was committing criminal actions. I wasn't involved with either of them. And yet I went to prison for both of their actions.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. And that's what I think, if the police ever wanted to, and let's hope they don't, and hopefully we don't have a Lord Sainsbury's character, but it would be the easiest thing in the world. I think they've done it before. Like the FBI certainly have done it before, where they can just plant evidence on you. Yeah. And if they plant evidence on someone involved in an open organizing thing and say, well, this person's planning this, then suddenly you have a huge conspiracy because everyone involved in the open organizing. Whereas the animal, and this is the thing, this is why they came so hard for us, apart from shutting us up, and not the ALF or whoever, is because they didn't know who it was. Like when they caught people, it was luck. Like my brother went to prison for Animal Liberation Front activism, and he got caught because he got caught at the scene doing something. If he hadn't been, they'd never have known who he was. And that was true of pretty much anyone that got caught doing ALF stuff. Yeah. It was luck. It was lucky policing. It wasn't investigations. It wasn't informants. It wasn't any of that, because these people were working alone, or they're working with friends or family, or people they've known since like childhood. And you can't break that. And the police never did break that. I don't think, certainly during the SHAC period, that the people active in the ALF, I don't think there was any ALF cell that was broken by the police during that period.
Yeah. I mean, I agree that one of the risks is something like planted evidence, but I think two things. One is that creates a risk vector for law enforcement. That's huge, because if you can point out they planted evidence, I mean, even the Weather Underground. So if you know the history of the Weather Underground, this is like
Mhm.
a militant anti-organization that actually was bombing people. So their plan was to bomb. I actually know two of the people who were involved in the Weather Underground, Bill Ayers and Bernadette Dorn. Bernadette Dorn was actually a colleague of mine when I was on the faculty at Northwestern, because she went on and became a law professor soon after. But part of the reason they got acquitted, they had all the charges dismissed against them, was because the government used all these underhanded tactics and it was exposed and they had to drop all the charges. But even if you can't expose it, I can just say this as a lawyer who's argued a lot of cases. If I can say on behalf of my client or even on behalf of myself, these people have been transparent from day one. There, if there's some planted evidence that comes forward that says, oh, they're going to burn something down. And for the record, I just want to say, I think arson should basically never be done. I think people have done it with good intentions, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but my position is arson should be a tactic that's just never used, because there's too much risk of death. Like there's too much risk that animals will die, even insects. Like, I mean, I just made a video about how spiders are sentient beings. We should not be hurting spiders. You cannot burn a building down without hurting a lot of animals, and so it should just never be done, in my view. I also think it's perceived as violent. It's not violent, but it's perceived as violent. But that's neither here nor there. The point is, if they were to plant evidence that we had engaged in arson, and I could testify and say, look, this is completely inconsistent with everything these activists have done over the last 10 years. Everything they've done, they've openly owned. So how could this possibly be the one case in their 10-year history when their entire strategy, their entire modus operandi, their values, like one of our values is openness, right? We're open about everything. The industry loves hiding things. The vivisectors, the factory farmers, they love passing ag gag laws and shutting down their doors and criminalizing photography. On the other hand, we're just open about everything. That is an incredibly powerful narrative. And one of the reasons I was acquitted in the Smithfield trial was the jurors just recognized, they said, like, these people are pretty open about everything. And in UK law in particular, so there's cultural reasons I think open organizing make, just in terms of the cultural narrative, but then there's also like very technical legal reasons. So in the UK, and there's similar provisions of law in the United States, you know about the honesty prong of
Mhm.
the theft charges? Yeah. So one of the prongs of a theft case in the UK is you have to prove people acted dishonestly. And if you're completely open about what you did from day one, it's a lot harder to argue that these activists acted dishonestly. And that means you can win in court, right? Which is a huge thing, because that, if you go back even to like the Somerset case in the anti-slavery movement, Brown versus Board of Education in the United States, these like historic cases where you win, they're sort of signals for the entire society that, hey, things like got to change. Because when a jury or even a judge gets a chance to deliberate on this, they side with the animal rights activists. And one of the ways you can get there is by finding these little legal technical arguments, like the honesty provision of UK theft law, that will allow you to prevail in court, which is a huge victory. But
Yeah.
anyways, I mean, that's my perspective on
I,
that.
I, I also think open rescue and open organizing has a huge role in our movement. I think that there's
Mhm.
cases where some people need to be protected, and I think
Yeah,
that's important. But
that's true too. I agree.
I do agree with that. I know in British law, because this has been, because it's what everyone's doing, really. Like
Mhm.
DXE are doing it, obviously, and you have Animal Rising doing it, and you have Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, Enslaved Britain. They're all doing it, Palestine Action. And so
Mhm.
now some of these provisions are being removed or
Yep.
eroded
Yeah.
or dismissed.
Like the
So
consent defense, I think there was like some case or law recently that narrowed the consent defense after a bunch of climate
yeah,
activists were
so
acquitted
that
on.
they
Yeah,
are trying to stop these
yeah, they're
defenses.
trying to stop it. Yeah,
Massively undemocratic, but
yeah.
I think it's vitally important. I think it's a huge tool. I think it's quite an exciting thing. I've been very marginally helping with Animal Rising on their Beagle case and stuff, and I find it
Cool.
very exciting. I think there's a huge potential there. I think particularly
Yeah,
in that one where they rescue these dogs, it's essentially going to be putting the industry on trial, because
absolutely.
if you normally you go and you're like, oh, I didn't break into that place, then the trial becomes like, yes, you did,
Yeah, did you do
and
it?
we're going
Yeah.
to prove it. Whereas if you say, oh no, I did break in and I had a good reason, then the trial
Hmm.
has to be, what was the reason, and
Yep.
then you're
Yep.
putting the industry on trial. So I think it's hugely effective. I think it can be overdone, like any tactic. It can be overdone, and I
Of
think it
course.
can
Yeah.
lose its potency through that, and it can become dangerous, I think, sometimes. But no, I'm all for everything. I think we need more of
Mm.
everything, not less of anything. I won't say my views on arson because I don't have a First Amendment.
You poor Brit.
Uh,
The poor Brits, they don't have a First Amendment. That's so sad.
yeah, it's fun having no freedom of speech. I'm so proud of my country.
Oh.
But yeah, I think we need people to do what they feel is best. I feel even with the violence, I can't get into it because I'm not violent.
Sure.
I don't
No
support
freedom of
violence
speech.
cause.
Mhm.
I don't think it's helpful is the main reason. I don't think it's like not even a moral argument. I don't think there is a moral argument against it. But I think in
Yeah.
terms of a strategy, I just don't think it's helpful. I
It's
think we're too
counterproductive.
small and
Yep.
alienated a movement to
Mhm.
do that. I think
Mhm.
you look at the IRA; they had mass public support in
Mhm.
certainly in Ireland, Northern Ireland, but they were doing all kinds of horrific things. And
Mhm.
so I don't think violence necessarily alienates the public. I think,
This is the Irish Republican Army, for the record. It's
yeah,
not an animal rights group.
no, no,
It's a yep.
I think the animal rights movement has been fairly consistently non-violent. I think the instances that can be brought up as, so, like on that one hand of violence,
Mhm.
and so I feel like we've never been a violent movement. I don't think we ever will be, to be honest. But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Is that everything
Cool.
I was answering? I can't remember
Yeah, I
now.
think so. All right. So we've been going 2 hours, 20 minutes. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate this is a lot of fun. I think we could talk for hours more. And I honestly haven't even I don't feel like I've even kind of gone beyond the surface a lot of the stuff that I could ask you about. But we have gone quite some time. So maybe we can just conclude by saying, is there one lesson you'd like to pass along to animal advocates, activists, vegans from your years of activism that you hope people take home?
Yeah, I think, I mean, a few things, but I think one thing is I see people kind of often overthinking a problem. And I
Mm,
think, like, how do I do this the most effectively? How do I have, like, what's the one action I can do that's going to change everything? And I think just stop thinking like that. Like, yeah, like if you have the capacity to be, strategic about it, then do so. But any action is better than no action. Um,
100%.
and and recognize your autonomy. If you think something might be effective, then just do it. And even
Yeah.
if you think you're pissing in the wind or whatever, like doing something as part of something much bigger is incredibly powerful. And if you're fly posting, if you're putting up stickers, like whatever little thing you can be doing, even outreach, petitioning, street theater, like
Mhm.
anything you can do, within your skill set or any skills you can learn, just be active.
Just
And
do
you
it.
don't
Yeah.
have to do that with the constraints of an organization. You can do that because it's the right thing to do, and you can do it in support of an organization without being part of
Mhm.
an organization. And I think that's an incredibly powerful thing. I think I'd tell everyone that set up a local animal rights group. Literally, just advertise a meeting, a monthly meeting, or
Mhm.
bi-monthly, whatever, and just see who comes. And it might be you and one of your mates from college or whatever, but just keep doing it, and more people will come. Keep advertising it, do some fun actions. You don't need 1,000 people to have an effective protest. Like some of the most effective protests I've been on were just me and one other person, or
Yeah.
sometimes even me or myself. And that's not an ego thing. Like it is, you can be incredibly powerful just going out and taking a stand and doing something and making the right conversations and talking to the right people and being obnoxious in the right way. Like you can be incredibly powerful on your own. So you don't need to wait for someone to come up with something. Like you can be the change. I think that's the biggest thing. And I mean, prison, I don't, I kind of came from the culture where we kind of mocked, but the idea of going to prison, like, oh, it's just, like boarding school. It's like,
Mhm.
it's just a like spa retreat is fine. And so I'm a little bit blasé about it. And I know people that have had horrific experiences in prison, but we all survived it.
Yeah.
Like everyone in the SHAC campaign survived it. And, there's, PTSD and, people are struggling from various parts of it, but, I'm still here. It's not that bad. I've definitely
Yeah.
been worse places. And I just, yeah, I think often, if you go somewhere like MBR Acres, we have 2,000 dogs being bred to die. Like the only thing that stands between them is not the razor wire fencing, it's not the cameras, it's not the security guard, it's not even the police. It's just like
That's in your
us
head. I agree.
in our head,
That is so important.
and we can make those changes. When I first became involved in this movement, into fauna is now MBR Acres, where these dogs are. I was told from day one, like, you cannot get in that place anymore. It was raided in
Yeah.
1999, and that's it. Like, that was such a military operation; it will never happen again. Like, no one will be able to get in. And 2 years after that, I just climbed over the fence on a protest and spent 2 hours in there. And I was like, what was the
That
fuss?
wasn't that
It
hard.
was razor
Yeah.
wire. And then no one else went in for another 20 years. And then
Mhm.
because no one had told Animal Rising it was impossible, they
Yeah,
just
they
turned
just
up
went
to
in.
bolt
Yep.
cutters and kicked down a door and got
Got a bunch
23
of
dogs
beagles
out.
out. I know.
So
Amazing.
so I think it just shows that you can do stuff. Like we can all do stuff, and we should all do stuff, and just stop waiting for other people. Just just do something.
Yeah. The
And that
barriers of the mind are the most insidious barriers in the human
had the cop in
species.
your head is
It's
yeah.
not It's not the
Like,
fence, it's not the cops, it's the barrier in your mind. I agree with that
100%.
100% because I was so scared of coming close to a slaughterhouse for so long, much less walking into it. And once I crossed that psychological barrier of realizing I can do this, that's what changed my life and my activism. So
And I
beautiful
think there's
thought.
things you
Thank you
can
for sharing.
do to make it easier. I think things that, I mean, I'm sure there's similar things in the US, but going hunt sabbing, going out, stopping the
Mhm.
fox hunting in the UK, it's such a, I think, again, a powerful way to kind of put yourself in a position where there might be a cop next to you that will arrest you for trespass if you go in this field.
Mhm.
But there's also a fox running past with like 20 hounds in pursuit.
Mm.
And if I
Yeah,
jump this
so
fence with
sad.
it, and I can just spray and the hounds will stop, the fox will get
So,
away, I can
yeah.
save a life and I might get arrested. Those
Yeah.
moments where you radicalize yourself, it's like, I have to do something
Mhm.
now. It's so powerful. So go sabbing if you can do, or go on a save vigil, go and meet these people
Mhm.
that are
Mhm.
dying. Go and have that experience and realize that you have to do, you can do something. You might not be able to save that life, but
Yeah.
there's millions more you can save.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I think find those kind of ways of making things easier, and being arrested isn't the end of the world for most
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. I haven't said this too much, but I didn't spend nearly as long in jail as you did, or Lauren did, or some of these other activists. But I've been in and out of jail, like mostly small stints for you know many years. My longest stay was most recent one. Um, and I haven't said this much because I think I want to be careful about saying this because I know this isn't everyone's experience. But to be bluntly honest, the time I spent in jail a few months ago was probably the most peaceful time I've had in the last 10 years. And that's weird because a lot of crazy shit happened in jail, but it was very peaceful in a lot of ways too. And I don't want to get into it because we're at the end of this conversation. And so a lot of it has to do with just preparing yourself over years. Because I mean, part of the reason it was peaceful is because I had 20 years to prepare for that experience. I knew so many people went to prison. I knew what I wanted to do when I was in jail. I had a sense of what a jail was even like because I had done support for other activists. And so when I was in jail, it was not unproductive time. And there were definitely a lot of incredibly frustrating and sometimes scary things happening, but it was incredibly peaceful and it was incredibly meaningful. But all right, last thing I just want to say is Tom, where can people find your book and where can people follow you?
So my book is Your Neighbor Kills Puppies. It is available from Pluto Press as the publisher. You can get it straight from them, or Burning Books in the US has it, and a lot of other independent bookstores. It's I'm not going to mention the evil corporation that also stocks it, but yeah, if you if you Google Your Neighbor Kills Puppies, I'm sure you'll find it from many places. Please don't buy it from Amazon. And and yeah, and you can find me. I mean, I'm a tattoo artist by trade. I don't like
Oh,
social
cool.
media. I'm a
Yeah.
tattoo artist, so I have a business account for my tattooing, which is also my personal account because
Hmm.
I don't want a personal account. So tattoo_Tom on Instagram is my handle. That's a good place to find me, connect with me. I respond to everyone on
Cool.
there. I don't
Yeah.
tend to
Well,
accept people on Facebook unless I know them. So yeah, Instagram's good. Tattoo Tom.
great. Well, thank you so much for sharing, Tom, and for the tremendous work for animals, the sacrifices you made. I think I hopefully speak for everyone in our audience is that you're a hero to me and to many others. And, I feel the same way. Like, I mean, but you are, you are. And let's talk again sometime soon. Okay.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
All right.
Thank you for having
Good
me.
stuff. Yeah, absolutely. We don't have to hurt animals. You can protect them. We don't have to kill them. We can care for them. And that's who we're meant to be, right? That's who we are when we're at our best. We're caring for each other and for the other living beings of this earth and not hurting them.